There's a lot that I want to do. Shall we start with 1965?
Okay.
Shall we start with when you first came to Korea, which I believe was in 1965, Mr.
November. This time
November.
of year, 1965.
I came November 2005, so 40 years after you, but in November, and it was colder than I imagined it would be.
It's not the time to first arrive in Korea. You want to come in September.
Yeah. What did it, in 1965, what did Korea smell like? What did the food taste like? What did the people look like?
I liked that question because the sights and the smells and the tastes and the ambiance were a lot of what overwhelms people. And a lot of people in those days were repulsed by Korea because there were offensive smells all over the place. And the overwhelming thing that I remember best was the poverty. People were really, really poor. And per capita income was $125 per year, per capita income, which is grindingly poor.
What does that mean in reality?
Well, it's a distortion because that's $125 of those years, not today's years. You couldn't live for 20 minutes on $125 in sold a day. You spend more than that in parking fees. You could get by with that. Food was cheaper. I remember $1 was 271, and pulgogi was 271. So in other words, $1 of food, $1 pulgogi was a big treat.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money to spend for a meal.
Was there much meat?
There was enough that you could get pulgogi whenever you wanted it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I actually think there was more beef than pork. That can't possibly be. But no, pulgogi was available. If you wanted that treat, you could get it. And other treats were tangsuyuk at the Chungguk Shikdang.
Wow.
And that was a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And it's funny, in those days, another aspect of it was the Japanese influence was still strong. For example, we didn't say gunmandu, we said yakimandu. And we didn't say bogumpap, we said yakimeshi, which is really a strange Japanese kind of word. We never said yakiniku. We always said pulgogi. But we said yakimeshi and yakimandu.
It's interesting how, since I've been here, it's changed from dakdoritang to dakbokumtang.
Yeah.
People pick me up on that.
Yeah. The thing about Korea is it's so dynamic. It changes all the time. And when I look at Korea with my 1965 eyes, which I do from time to time, in fact, this trip, having not been here for 3 years, when I look at Korea in a lot of places, I roll back the eyes to the 1965, and I think, oh my goodness, this is especially Gangnam. Oh my goodness, that's just such a off the charts, unbelievable set of structures. In 1965 is when I arrived. I left in 1968, and I remember the supervisor of the mission, the wife of the supervisor of the mission, said one day in 1968, there was news that a 5-story set of walk-up apartments, a whole new thing, walk-up 5 stories tall apartments built along the Han River, were built in a flood zone before the Han River had been dammed and protected. Yeouido was a sandbar, which was an emergency airplane landing strip.
Right.
And you couldn't use it. You couldn't build a structure on it because it would be flooded every year in the floods. But they've built enough dams upstream to control the monsoon rains. But not in 1968, and the bank was washed away underneath the foundations of this 5-story set of apartments. And everyone got out okay because they could see the trouble was it happened over a few days, but it was washing away and they couldn't stop it, and the whole set of apartments fell into the river. And the thing that the supervising woman in our group said, somehow these people need to learn how to live on top of each other. And I reflected back on that from time. Yeah, they might have to learn to live on top of each other. I mean, that's where they all live now. And
They've learnt it very well, that lesson, haven't they?
very well. And over the years, I've seen this 5-story walk-up as one stage, and then I saw the 12-story elevator. And
What is a walk-up? Sorry, just an apartment with stairs?
No elevator.
Okay.
Yeah, just a walk-up. Maybe that's New York expression. It's not Utah expression. We don't have walk-ups, but I think
Yeah.
I think that's a New York City expression. An apartment complex that has no elevator.
Okay.
Then there was a phase in the mid-70s when I was here where you had 12-story elevators, and then you had 17-story the Bompo complex. I think Bompo was 12 stories. Anyway, then you start seeing 17 and 20-story buildings, and then you start seeing 30-story buildings. These days, there are 50-story apartments in Daegu and Busan.
Yeah.
I think there are a few around here, 50 stories tall. Somehow these people need to learn how to live on top of each other.
I want to live on the first floor. What was because today, with the 50-story apartments, the summers feel very hot, the winters feel very cold, but we have aircon and we have heaters. Like in 1965, how do you survive the summers? How do you survive the winters?
You didn't. You died. You died in the winter. You died in the summer. We used to laugh about. There was a naive presentation from many Koreans from their school days that Korea is a wonderful place that has 4 seasons.
Oh, I've heard it many times. Yeah.
And it's as if it's the only country in the world that has 4 seasons, where you and I from Utah and UK
Dover.
you're a Dover man.
Yeah.
Where you have 4 seasons, but the trouble with the Korean 4 seasons are they're not 4 good seasons. There are 2 good seasons and 2 awful seasons.
Yep.
The winters here are really cold and biting, and the summers are just unbearably hot and muggy. But we've got 4 seasons. Fortunately, the springs and the autumns are just beautiful in this country.
Yeah. There weren't hot packs of the little things that you put in your pocket?
Heavens no.
Just lots of layers you wore? Or?
You just wore lots of layers. You'd get gloves. You'd wear a hat. You'd have a sweater and then a coat on top of that and a coat on top of that. And you had the ondol bong. We all had ondol bong back in those days. And you'd be out in freezing cold, and you come home and sit on the ondol bong and put the ebul up around your shoulders, and you warm up and be nice and toasty, and you were okay.
Nice.
Yeah. Central heat, forget it. It was all ondol, and we at times lived in places where the ondol floor was nice and warm, but you could see your breath outside your blanket. And it was cold enough in the room that you could see the steam from your breath, but the sleeping was warm, and if you can sit and toast your bottom on the ondol floor, you'd survive.
What was the summer then like? You have the hand fans, I guess.
Had hand fans, and you just survived. Somehow there was no relief. There was never any relief, and any building you operated in, they'd have institutional fans. A fan to cool off the whole space. But no, the summers were just hot and miserable, but that's the way it was. You just live with it.
What would in 1965, did you have an impression of what the people were like? And was it an old population? Was it a young population? Did you see the whole demographic? Was it mainly masculine or?
We'd see the whole demographic, and it was... the masculine-feminine thing was very marked because the men were men and the women were women, and it was difficult. It was a difficult life. We saw a lot of students. We interacted most with students because they were the most interested in learning English and talking to foreigners. But we talked to older people, and I remember one of the first people I knew was a man who was very gentle and kind, and he was very sensitive at that point because he found a lot of solace in the church in that he had 3 sons and the baby boy had just died. and he had like a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, but they'd just lost the little one. And I don't quite know how he died. It might have been natural causes, but this gentleman was very sensitive and very emotional.
Mm.
And so, the thing that impressed me about the people was the genuineness of the people.
Mm.
There was no artificiality because there was nothing to be artificial about.
Right.
You didn't have any money to hide behind. You didn't have any status to hide behind. You had nothing, and that's who you were. And so there was a certain genuineness of the people that I really enjoyed that is still there, but sometimes you have to break through a little bit of the barriers to get to it. But the Confucian and the Buddhist and the traditions just make people caring and concerned about other people. Now, when I say that to Koreans, very often they'll say, "Oh no, we're cold to each other," and they are to each other. But the foreigner breaks through, and it's somehow part of the Confucian shtick that Confucius himself said in the No-No, in the Analects, two things that are absolutely epical and mark the story for Koreans. One is there's nothing of greater pleasure than to study.
It's the first line of the first book, I believe, isn't it? Yeah.
And the second line is, nothing is more pleasurable to greet a guest who has come from afar.
Yeah, that's right.
And the first line of Mencius says, King Hui of the Liang dynasty says, "Sir, you have not considered 1,000 li too far, yet you have come to see me." So the idea of traveling from afar to see you, the Korean person you're visiting with, is greatly prized, and they're happy to host you, which over the years for me has become burdensome because they always treat. And if I want to pay for the dinner, no, I'm a guest, and I have to resort to all sort of artifices to pay my fair share. And I feel very guilty about it because I've been a freeloader most of my time here. I've accepted the idea that, oh no, you're a guest, and okay, but I have to resort to all sort of artifice, like you get up and go to the bathroom just before you leave, and you pay the clerk on the way, or you tell the clerk coming in, you give the clerk your credit card and say, "I'm not going to take any nonsense from this. I'm treating today, and I don't want them to pull their card out." So, no, Koreans are generous to a fault, perhaps. That they. In those days, people didn't have any money, but they felt like they had to take you out to dinner once in a while. And there were times where people would treat for dinner, and I knew they didn't have any money to do that. But yet they felt, we can bust the bank once or twice a year. And that was the sense I had. They didn't give me that sense, but as I looked at their finances of the average person, I knew that this meal was something they couldn't do every month. And so the people were so remarkably generous and kind and outgoing. That's the thing that struck me about it, and that's one of the reasons I've stuck with it. In a sense, I've never gone home.
Very nice.
Even teaching and living in Utah, BYU, and even studying at Harvard, that was all sort of a temporary thing. I was sort of forever stuck here in some mental state. I don't know quite how to explain that. Does that make any sense?
It does. I worry that I'm seeing my future looking at you. I do want to get onto Confucianism, but when you say, for example, about going to the restaurant and they would treat you, I do get the impression sometimes that I might have quite a positive view of South Korea because of treatment like you described that I get, and my young students at the university, especially the women, they would say, "That's not the Korea that I experienced, David." So there are many different Koreas, but in 1965 when you went to the restaurants, two questions. One, were they predominantly sitting on the floor then?
Always,
right. And
and that's one thing that struck me about this trip. In the last 3 years, they've gone from the sitting on the floor rooms All the sitting on the floor rooms have been converted to shoes on and sit at a table.
Sometimes you get one where your feet go down into
Yeah.
a thing, so you get the illusion of it, but you're still sitting on a chair.
And I went to a restaurant the other day that has a sunken hole, but it's
Yeah.
been covered over, and they're sitting on tables now.
Okay.
So, but for me, in the old days, it was no problem because my
Yeah.
knees were very supple. I could sit like the Buddha for
Yeah.
hours. You know, I imagined myself as the Buddha. You know, in a lotus position with my knees knuckled under me. A lot of my Western friends couldn't get their knees down. They sat with their knees sort of arched up as they were sitting there. I could always do it. But now my knees are arthritic, and I can't do the lotus sit anymore. So I'm grateful. Korea has changed every restaurant just for me. I'm so delighted.
As it should. The second question about the restaurants in 1965, what was being drunk? What was being drunk at that time? Was it makgeolli? Was it soju? Was it in like cups, shot glasses, beer?
Yes. All of the above. But I'm not the one to ask about drinking culture because I don't drink. And
Okay.
So I was separate from that.
Yeah.
You see it, you know, I understand it. In fact, I've had more than one occasion where someone who enjoys the drink of Korea, which is a fantastic culture, and a lot of people just really enjoy that. And I've had some people say, "You've lived in Korea all these years and you never drank?" And I said, "Well, yes." And they said, "Well, how could you possibly do it?" And I said, "Well, the secret is you don't drink at all."
Yeah.
Because if you drink a little, there's no such thing as a little.
One is too many, 10 is not enough.
Yeah.
For
yeah.
me.
So, no, I've seen drinking culture. You know, in a sense, thinking about this, last night driving home, I went past a crosswalk, and two guys were stumbling over, and one just fell down right on the ground. And his drunken friend leaned over him as if he were any better. He wasn't really. and I think in the old days we used to see more people that were, quote, falling down drunk. Because, you know, there was very little other entertainment. And there always seemed to have been liquor.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think soju and mekju has always been around. Koreans in subsequent years have become more connoisseur of the Western liqueur, the wines and the whiskeys. I don't know if they've gotten into any of the other liquors that are available, the champagnes or the other more sophisticated liquors. But whiskey and wine are on the scene now.
Yeah.
And though I don't partake, I see and know it's there and see it's there indeed. Yeah.
What was there a curfew in six? Because the curfew ended in
yes.
82.
Oh, yes. Oh, in 65, absolutely curfew. But that didn't affect me as a missionary because you had to go home anyway. We were never out till midnight. We had our own internal 10 o'clock, 10:30 curfew. But when I was a student here, and my wife and I would go out socializing, we very often ended up staying at the friend's house because we couldn't get out in time to get home and get a taxi. As a student here, I didn't have a car, of course.
When were you a student here, sorry? Is this in the 70s, or?
Two occasions. 74 for one semester, postmaster's degree, sort of exploring a PhD possibility. And then from the whole year of 77 into the first half of 78, I was a PhD student researcher here. Okay. When I say student, people ask what university I attended. I was affiliated with both Koryo University and Seoul National. I spent most of my time at the Seoul National University Library doing my research. But socially, my wife and I would visit friends, and we had one friend in particular. He had a very nice house in Hanamdong, a friend from New Zealand and a friend from school, and he worked for General Motors and had a big, nice house. And I and his wife liked to play Scrabble. And my wife tolerates Scrabble. It's okay. And the friend tolerated Scrabble, but he allowed the good humor of his wife to play Scrabble. So she and I were the Scrabble players, and the other two just tagged along. Yeah. But, you know, Scrabble doesn't... you can't get through a good Scrabble game very quickly. My golly, if you haven't finished your Scrabble game by 11:15, forget it. and so we'd finish one game at 10:30 maybe. Well, let's play one more. Well, that means we're staying over. And so we didn't have things prepared, but we'd stay over at their place and then go home in the morning.
What did the curfew look like? Were there people patrol? Was it like was there a fear? Was it just you just don't go outside?
You just don't go outside. It just everybody does it. I mean, you don't. I talked to some foreigners in the embassy and such, and they'd talk about how they could get around the curfew and they could get by at night. In fact, embassy and military people would purposely wait till the closed down so they wouldn't be caught in the hectic traffic of trying to get home. And they would they'd wait till the 12 o'clock bell had rang, and then they'd get out and drive. And with diplomatic plates, they had some immunity and be waved through the different checkpoints. There were checkpoints at major intersections, not all over the place.
What does a checkpoint look like?
3 or 4 policemen just out in the middle of the road, barricades up, and you had to drive up to the policeman, or I guess it was a military. No, it could. I was seldom out at that point. It was either police or military. I think more police now that I think about it. And you drive up to the barricade, and they'd look at you, shine your light. They wouldn't shine your light in your face. They know that's rude. They'd shine the light in an oblique way so they could observe your face and see you were a foreigner. And they'd see the license plate was a diplomat plate, and they'd just check and maybe look to make sure there weren't any North Korean spies holding you hostage in the back seat or something. They'd look at you a little bit, and they'd just wave you on. And you'd drive for another 2, 3, 4 miles till you hit your next checkpoint, and then eventually you get home. So, no, it was a great crackdown. Everybody, 11 o'clock hour was crazy. And people had to get home sometimes. Sometimes people wouldn't go home. They'd stop in a flophouse hotel for $10,000 or whatever it was in those days, and which was an excuse for a lot of dalliances.
Hanky-panky?
Obviously, yeah. Out drinking, I can't get home in time, and so there you are. But one interesting thing that would happen is you were desperate to get home, and the taxi drivers had license not to pick you up if you weren't going in their direction, because they had to get to their chago, their garage for the night, and their home for the night. And so taxi drivers would strategize on where they would take their last fare beginning like 10:30 or certainly by 11. And if the last fare was away from home, they'd drop off that fare and then they'd head home, and they wouldn't pick up anybody unless they were heading their direction. So the taxi driver would slow down, roll down his window, and you'd call out where you were going. And if it was close to where the taxi driver was going, you'd get a ride. And people would do interesting things. They'd hold up 2 fingers. So like a victory sign, it was 2 fingers, meaning I'll pay double. I'll pay triple. Take me home. I got to get home. I'll pay quadruple. So a taxi driver heading home would think, it's triple up there. He'd pull over close, and if it was somewhere in the direction he's going, he'd take him home. And there was doubling up too. The taxi driver, if he was heading from Dongdaemun to Mapo, and he hears one guy call Mapo, he'd give him a ride, and he'd slow down for the next group of people here, and he hears another Mapo, and he'd say, "Hey, do you mind if we double up?" "Oh yeah, any ship in a storm," and so everybody would double up. It was crazy, interesting though, but absolutely crazy.
There will be some people listening to this, I think, going, it's still like that today to try to get a taxi late at night. You mentioned, beautiful segue, I don't know, you obviously didn't do it intentionally, but just about these checkpoints briefly, is that sometimes even today there'll be breathalyzer checks, and the police will put up little barricades and everybody has to go through, and I will then drive through and they'll see me as a foreigner and they'll just wave me through.
Oh, they'll cut you slack.
They'll cut, and I feel like, no, I want to be checked as well. I didn't drink. I'm a good boy tonight. Come on, please check me. But they'll just wave me through. And
you do get some preference.
You do get some preference. Maybe it's because, I don't know, being a man or however it might be. But
yeah.
I do sometimes want to be treated the same, like you were mentioning with the paying the bills. You mentioned about ambassadors or diplomats, police checking that they didn't have a North Korean spy in the bag and things like that. Now, even today in 2022, we see the missiles fly. What was what was the atmosphere towards the North back then? Was there this horrible spectre of communism hanging over there?
Absolutely.
How did that feel?
There were signs all over the place that said, Pan Gong Bang Chup.
Anti-communism and anti-Tupman?
Spy.
Okay.
Turn in spies.
Yeah.
Catch spies. So those signs were up all over the place. And one day they just all came down, probably in the 70s sometime. But no, those signs were all over. There was a certain degree of suspicion of foreigners, too, to some degree. They just wanted to make sure. The government agents were a little less fearless. Government agents would sort of double-check foreigners as well. I had a friend that came into the country to study, and he had some books about the Chosun dynasty with him in his luggage. And the agent at the airport, Chosun, you've got books about Chosun. And he only thought of Chosun as the North Korean Chosun. And so my friend was harassed for having books about Chosun, and he eventually convinced them that there was a Chosun dynasty. But no, there was a certain degree of paranoia that showed up in lots of different ways. I had a friend who was drinking one night in a restaurant and laughing about Park Chung-hee and how draconian he was, and and he was with a couple of young Korean students. There's a Peace Corps volunteer who was with a couple of Korean students, and well, he got himself arrested. The police came and they found out who he was, and they tracked down the students and gave them a good what for. In fact, he might have spent, I don't think he spent the night in jail, but he spent some time at the police station. And so, yeah, there was a lot of paranoia, or maybe that's not the right word, just caution about, who you could trust. Because there were incidences of spies slipping in and doing this and that. And, of course, the North, for their part, was convinced that there was a fifth column down here, that if they could just get the South organized, they would surely want to have freedom from the oppression in the South. The North Korean propaganda toward the South was really, really incredibly naive. I was in Nepal one time in the 74, and so still early enough that people were quite paranoid. And I was just out jogging for exercise, and I saw a flag that I thought, what's that flag? Is that a North Korean flag? I wasn't even sure at that point. And I stopped at the embassy and chatted them up. And, you speak a little Korean, and you use it at the North Korean embassy. And they saw me as a candidate, I guess. They were very friendly to me and gave me some literature. And it had things about how awful it is in South Korea with Americans kidnapping Koreans to adopt and send them off to America to work in the cotton fields. The cotton fields went mechanical 100 years ago from that time. So, no, there was a lot of naivete on both sides about just who could be trusted and what was what.
And did that mistrust also extend towards the government? Because Park Chung-hee himself is either the man that built modern Korea or it's a very difficult conversation. I'm just curious about the feeling on the ground at the time.
Still today, is like it was back in those days. It's sort of an even split.
Yeah.
It's sort of the left and the right. There are people today who laud Park Chung-hee for building the economy and doing all he did. And then you have other people who said, he was just such an autocrat and abused human rights and democracy. And there's the story out there that Park really didn't build the economy, that he just mobilized all the people that could build it.
Yeah.
And that if he hadn't been around, that it had been built anyway, because he utilized people like Nam Do-gu, who was his main economic advisor. And when I was a missionary here, the students I would run into I'd say, "What's your major?" Economics. Oh, that's interesting. What's your major? Economics. Oh, that's what's your major? Economics. It seemed like everybody was majoring in economics because they knew that Korea was poorer than it should be.
Yeah.
Korea knew at that point that it was not a third world country.
Mm-hmm.
That it may appear as such, but it's really not. And I think there was a certain confidence that underrode all of this economic development, that we're not developing from an underdeveloped state to a developed state. We are developing back to the upper level state that we know we are. And so it was sort of a recovery thing, not a developmental thing. And I haven't heard anybody say that, but I think that's the case, because inherently within the Korean psyche, there's the sunbi. And the sunbi is the scholar. And in one of my YouTubes recently, I compared the sunbi to the samurai. And when the traditional order fell apart, the samurai were samurai. And there's a case of the 47 Ronin, the masterless samurai that killed themselves, a mass suicide, because they couldn't survive in the modern world without a master. And then you got the other samurai that led us to World War II, simply put. Expansion into Korea, expansion into Manchuria, expansion into Southeast Asia, and bang, there's World War II. So what happened when the traditional world fell apart? For Japan, the samurai'd.
Yes.
How's that for a?
It's a good verb. I like it. You're going to do the same with zombie.
I'm going to say the Koreans sunbead.
Yeah.
Indeed, the Koreans, they didn't know what to do when the traditional world fell apart, but they knew they should study, and they knew that study was the key, because study had always been the key, and they did not abandon study, but they held on to study, and the impoverished Yangban of the late Chosun period became the impoverished Yangban of the Japanese era, where some studied modern things and some held on to old traditional things. But study was still the key. And so as the Japanese samurai'd, the Koreans sunbead.
Yes.
And that's the difference between the two cultures.
And still today, when you talk about that confidence and this restoration, it's not developing, it's going back to what it was. If I show my Korean students at the university, this is a chart of soft power. Here you can see in the world, the global rankings, Korea is number 7 or 8. My students will look at me and go, "Why are we not number 1? Excuse me, what's going on here?"
Yeah.
And they will be sort of genuinely dumbfounded that Korea isn't number 1, because that's what they kind of expect from their country. And I think that's why sometimes the incidents or the tragedies, they hurt more because they're not as perceived. Now, you talked about the zombie and the differences between the samurai. The pen is mightier than the sword, and education today is still so fierce and competitive. It needs to sort of, I think, I love the education culture and what it produces, but it perhaps needs some reform. It's probably a good chance for us to turn into Confucianism, because you've done a lot of work on Confucianism. And when international students come here to learn Korean studies, and I'm never really sure that I can get across in words this idea that when you walk into a room, or if you're with Korean people, especially if you're speaking in Korean, there's a hierarchy, and you need to work out, okay, in this room, I'm number 1, so I have to lead the way, or maybe I'm a professor. In this room, I'm number 7, so I just got to sit here and shut up. But there's a hierarchy in the language and everything that goes with it. I'm not sure if that's Confucianism or if there's something else. You've given us the first line of the Analects, that dreadfully enigmatic word, Confucianism. Where do we start understanding it?
Well, I think it's largely misunderstood and overly worked, such that it's lost some of its meaning, and it gets attacked for some things it doesn't deserve.
Right.
But it does deserve some of the attack that it gets. My song and dance of late has been, I wish Koreans understood Confucianism better. And by better, I mean specifically that old Confucianism in Korea up until the late 17th century, which is what I wrote my dissertation about. Up until the late 17th century, Confucianism was really quite egalitarian. And these egalitarian measures you can see were equal inheritances, sons and daughters, absolutely equal inheritances. You look at these inheritance documents and you don't find that some subtle, the boys got all the strong men and the girls got all the weak women or something. No, the divisions was of the property of the slaves and the land was absolutely equal, meticulously equal. The ceremonies that are now considered part of the oppression of Confucianism, because it's all in the hands of the eldest son of the eldest son of the eldest son, the Chongson.
The Chale.
And you go to do the ceremonies at the Kunchip. In the early Chosun period, up through the middle Chosun period, there was no Kunchip. It was all done on an equal basis, the men and the women carrying out the ceremonies equally, taking their turns. And I often tell Korean groups, I understand that as an American or as a Westerner, because we get together for our chesa. We don't do chesa, but we get together in family units to celebrate holidays. Easter, Christmas, Labor Day, Memorial Day, Thanksgiving, New Year's Day, and we have parties very often by family. Sometimes it's with friends, but very often it's family. And if it's family, one day it's at Imo's house, and the next day it's at Komo's house, and the next day it's Chagan Abaji's house, and it goes around. The next day it's at my house, and we all take turns in hosting the ceremonies. Well, that's the way it was in Korea in the old days. Marriage was very egalitarian, and this is one thing that many Koreans really misunderstand completely, and that is that it used to be that Koreans would changakada, which is to say that the man would go live in his wife's house. Koreans always talk about shijip kada. And it's funny when you're learning the language, you learn kyoronhada, okay, you get married, and then you learn there's shijip kada and changakada. And if you're not careful listening in class, a man might say, Changnyeone shijip kasamnida. I got married last year. Well, a man does not shijip kada. That's only a woman's word. And a woman does not changa kada. But the words meant something in the old days. These days, people understand shijip kada because you go to the Shiabaji Shiomani's house. But they don't understand that the Koreans in the old days would changa kada, that the man would go and live in the woman's house. And there are numerous cases of it. Yulgok Senseng on the 5001 note was born in his mother's home. And if you ask any Korean where Yulgok was born, they'll say Ochukon, and that was the home of Shin Saimdang. They all know that. But they don't know that Ochukon was not built by Shin Saimdang and her father or her family. It was built by her mother's family, and she got it from her mother's family. It was Achu.
Bless me.
It was it was passed down from mother's lines for 4 generations before Yulgok was born there, which means that men were changaka. They were going to the wife's house to live. So my point is, Confucianism can survive in a egalitarian society. And the great masters of Korean Confucianism, Taege and Yulgok, lived in an egalitarian society. I'm a little hesitant to use that word because it wasn't fully egalitarian in that women could not hold government office.
There would have been lots of slaves as well, would there not?
And there would have been a lot of slaves. I'm using the term egalitarian in the sense of equal ownership of property and equal economic activity for the Yangban class. So Confucianism can exist in a egalitarian-looking place. It does not have to have all of the oppressive aspects of the patrilineal order, or what many people like to call the patriarchal order. I think that's a misuse of the term. It's more patrilineal. The Korean has a better term. They call it puge sahe. And what Koreans don't understand very often is that before there was puge sahe, they understand there were some non-patrilineal aspects of society. Every Korean understands that. But they tend to have a half-baked idea that Confucianism settled in the Chosun period, and they immediately became patrilineal, and the Puge Sahwe took over. And that's not at all true. The 500 years of the Chosun dynasty, the first 300 were more egalitarian, and the last 200 were this oppressive Puge Sahwe, male-dominated society. So I look at it this way, that Confucianism, when it came into Korea, was in the late Three Kingdoms period. And through unified Shilla, through the Koryo period, and through the first 3 centuries of Chosun, it was rather egalitarian, and I like to call this Korean-style Confucianism, because they purposely ignored the male dominance that was written into the texts. Confucius lived in a patrilineal society, and he assumed that all societies were patrilineal, I guess, because he wrote about how the eldest son should do this, the eldest son should do that, because the eldest son was doing everything. But Koreans ignored this eldest son business. When it said the eldest son should get all the property or the eldest son should do all the ceremonies, Koreans said, well, no, that's not what we do. The Shilla dynasty, Koryo dynasty, early Chosun, that's not what we do. We do it Korean style, which was more egalitarian and open. Well, in the late Chosun period, due to a number of factors, I think population pressure was as great a factor as anything. But there's also the maturation of the study of Confucius, which meant now we're going to start doing things the way Confucius talked about it, with dominance by the men. I see that as a sellout to the Chinese. And at the same time, we see what Koreans often complain about Chinese relationship, is sadejui.
Yeah.
And so I see this sellout to Chinese-style Confucianism as part of sadejui. And the reason this is important today is, on my YouTube channel, I see a lot of comments of, I hate Confucianism, I hate the patriarchal, patrilineal order. Chokbo is a useless waste of time. Ancestor ceremonies are a waste of time and money, and the Chongson should not be dominating. I see these criticisms of Confucianism as attempting to throw it out completely.
No.
And
baby and bathwater.
Yeah, and I see this as throwing out the baby with the bathwater, exactly. That there's a baby in that bathwater. And if you look at it closely, that baby, Confucianism, teaches you much of what you are, and the ideas of loyalty, filial piety. Koreans say inui yeji, benevolence, justice, ceremony, and intelligence. These are all part of the Confucian tradition that, frankly, you couldn't throw it out if you wanted to. And you don't want to throw it out. Confucius was one of the great masters of the world. He's one of the great teachers. Name me the 5 greatest teachers of the world, and you're going to say Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, maybe Lao Tzu, maybe Moses, maybe Mohammed. But Confucius is there. And Koreans need to hold on to their Confucianism, but they ought to do it in the way they used to do it, in a more open and egalitarian fashion. That's my song and dance on Confucianism.
I'm glad you mentioned Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
I was always a Tao, because I studied them during my master's and PhD, and I was always drawn towards the Taoism.
Oh, you're a Taoist
I
at
loved
heart?
it. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think I'm just a hippie, you know. But,
Well, I was going to say Taoism was 2,000 years old hippie.
yeah, so I think that's why I'm drawn to it. But reading the Analects, this baby in bathwater idea, reading the Analects, I don't come away from them deciding that I want to oppress people. Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. I read them and I find I want to become a better person. I want to treat people better. I want to study more. I want to be humble. It doesn't, and so, you know, democracy can lead to bad results, or capitalism can lead to equality, but perhaps it doesn't have to. And that's the same with Confucianism. It's maybe how it's interpreted. But I think spending time with the Analects, or spending time with Mengjiao or Mencius, that it doesn't have to lead to oppression.
And the king was a good guy in Korea because he was so heavily indoctrinated in Confucianism. And the kings, Sejong was not the only one, talked about the people. They were concerned about the people, much more so than the Chinese kings were. The Chinese emperors were famously licentious and very careless about the regard for the people. Now, my Chinese friends might get upset about that, but the Chinese royalty was never as considerate of the people as the Korean royalty was. And the Korean royalty was considerate of the people because they had to listen to lectures 3 times a day on Confucianism. And they get these ideals pounded into their heads from the time that they're the crown prince, from the time they're 3 or 4 years old till they die. And the one king that said, I'm not going to do this anymore, was Yunsan. Yunsan Gun, and he was deposed because he wasn't going to play the game. Even Kwanghae Gun, who was deposed, played the game. He was a fairly decent Confucian king.
What was the game? Sorry.
The game is to be a good Confucian king, to be respectful, and to take your duties as a king who is good to the people because you're part of the system. The goodness of Inui Yeji pertains to you, not just you telling the people about it.
Yeah.
So, the Korean kings were not bad dudes, unlike a lot of kings in a lot of other countries.
I'm not sure if the podcast has many Chinese listeners. I looked at some statistics once, and it was pretty global. But I'm not sure if I did see any. I'm not sure if it gets past the Great Firewall of China.
Yeah,
the Korea deconstructed. Could we talk about, please, the relationship between Korea and China? I just read a fascinating book that was published last year on 600 years relations between Korea and China. I forget the author. It was a Danish name. I believe his name was Odd.
I know who you mean. He's at Harvard, I think.
I believe so,
Yeah.
and his name has the word odd or strange in it, and that's why I've forgotten it. So
Yeah, and I've forgotten it too, but I know who you mean, yeah.
But what I want to ask here is many people will talk about not just Tangun, but there was Gija, and sometimes I've had people ask me, David, was Choson or was Korea back in the day, was it a vassal state? Was it really independent? Was it Chinese? What was the relationship, in your sense, honestly, between Korea and China during that?
Well, it's unfortunate that these days the Chinese are being such jerks. They're being jerks about it.
Certain people online are, I would suggest. And
Yeah.
online communication is always very,
But the idea is that arguing that Korea was a vassal state is a real corruption of the ideas. The Korea was always Korea. And Koreans knew they were Korean because they spoke Korean. And they didn't speak Chinese. They knew they used Chinese because they saw Chinese as a older culture. And they knew that they had bought into that culture. And they knew that the exams that they were given in Chinese. But they didn't see themselves as any less Korean because of it, any more than a Frenchman or a Englishman or a German in the old days were studying Latin. They didn't think of themselves as Italians. They just thought of themselves as studying the great classics, and that was all in Latin. And, all the great universities, Oxford is proud to be a 1,000-year-old university, but they were studying Latin back then. That doesn't mean they were Italians. It means they were studying Latin.
Certainly not.
Yeah, and the Koreans similarly, I think it's a very parallel analogy because Koreans argued at court. I've spent some time in the Shillok, and in the Shillok you see discussions with the king, and you see argument among people at court who will very often argue different sides of a case, and the king has to make the decision. But very often at court, it was a fairly common kind of argument. How common, I can't say if it happened once a year or once a month, but every now and again, people at court would say, well, yeah, you say that because the Chinese do that, but no, we're not Chinese. We don't have to do that. And they drew several lines in the sand about what was Chinese and what was not Chinese about themselves. One of the great misunderstandings, the term vassal state maybe can mean an independent vassal state, but it often implies a subservient state. And the Koreans did not see themselves as subservient to China in any way, shape, or form. They may have been a little less happy when the Manchus took over for a time, but eventually Koreans asserted their independence from the Manchu connection as well. But I think the key to understand Korea, the way I understand Korea and looking at China, is to look at the tribute system.
The tributary,
Yeah, and the tributary system is often called the tribute trade, and that's a more accurate term because if you say tribute and you think of the Roman conquerors or Alexander the Great or whoever of the old world, when they exacted tribute, it was usually 50% of what you owned. We'll take half, you get to keep the other half. Be grateful we don't kill you. But the Chinese weren't that way. The Chinese demanded tribute, but they also saw themselves in a tributary relationship where they had to reciprocate. And by statute, by agreement, Koreans were required to send tribute to China every Xingnian. The Xingnian is the ceremonial year, which is once every 3 years. In the ceremonial year, they would do three things. They would send a tribute to China. They would have an examination opportunity for people to take the exams, and they would do a census. These things were all on the triennial calendar.
Is it 3 because it's 3 and 4 of those equals 12, or is there a reason for the 3?
I think I'm not sure. I think it was just the way they did it. There was an appropriate year.
The great philosopher De La Salle said 3 is the magic number.
Yeah,
That was it.
And so they had to send tribute to China once every 3 years. How often did they send tribute to China? 3 times every year. 9 times in a 3-year period. They were required to send tribute once every 3 years. They sent 9 tribute missions in a 3-year period. What in the world is going on? Who wants to pay taxes at 9 times the given rate? Well, it wasn't taxes. This tribute was not tax. It was a show of mutual support and admiration. The Koreans outwardly admired China for all of its scholarship and tradition, the Confucianism, the Buddhism, and all of this. And so they sent off a tribute mission. But the Chinese were very magnanimous. They reciprocated. And at one point, the Chinese said, "Would you please quit sending so many tribute missions? You're breaking the budget here for us." But the Koreans loved to send the tribute mission because they not only sent tribute, they had the side trade that was going on. And so if an official were given the honor of being attached to a tribute mission, he would also take a couple of mules of his own, loaded with things of his own, and he'd trade those off for things that were even better and bring them back, and he could greatly improve his wealth and status by a good tribute mission to China. So when you look at the tributary relationship, I think it's best to include the word trade. This was the tribute trade, and it was beneficial for both sides. I think that describes the Korean relationship with China better than anything else. And I think the arguments at court saying we are not Korean, or we are not Chinese, we're Korean. Yes, we should do this in a Chinese way. No, we should not do that in a Chinese way. So those debates were very much alive at the court. So Koreans were deciding their own fate. They were deciding how Chinese they wanted to be. And in this regard, let me anticipate your next question, or let me ask myself the question that I want to ask, and that is, what's going on today? And today, the Chinese are abusing their wealth and power all over the place. They say that there's no one more obnoxious than a Chinese tourism group at the palace, that they don't behave respectfully and they're loud and such. Sorry, Chinese, blasting on the Chinese again. But
there's only a billion of them, don't worry.
Yeah. But, you know, the the Koreans reciprocate that arrogance by disliking the Chinese these days.
Yes.
And the point I want to make is when I came here in 1965 and when I studied in the 70s, when I worked here in the early 80s, the ambiance was respect for China. China had fallen into this corrupt communist state that had sent soldiers to fight in the Korean War, and that the China now at that time was this communist Chinese aberration. But China originally, the true China, the real China, the China of Confucius and of Mencius and of the Han Dynasty and of the Tang Dynasty, that China was to be admired, all over the place. And the scholars that I worked with now, maybe they more than ordinary people, would speak with great respect and reverence even for China. China was Big Brother, and not in the Orwellian sense, but in a Confucian sense of a good leader, a provider of culture, a provider of civilization. Here's one thing sort of on the negative side of the ledger, perhaps, is that Koreans talked about not being Chinese enough and not being civilized until they reached a certain point. And the Chosun Dynasty scholars talked about how they had achieved Munmyeong civilization by copying the Chinese, and that was literacy. What is Munmyeong? What is civilization? Well, it's partially Munhua, culture, and it's partially Munhak. It's all kinds of moon, and the moon was Chinese characters, and so they saw themselves culturally as affiliates of China. Picture the poor Korean king and the poor scribes of the king speaking in Korean and writing it down in Chinese. And the grammar is completely backwards. It's a completely different sort of approach. So the Koreans were in a real box because they saw the superiority of the moon. And the moon is the literature, and it's the Munhak, and it's the Munmyeong, and it's the Munhua. All these things are moon. And they saw that as all Chinese. So it was a matter of gratitude to the Chinese, not a matter of being oppressed by the Chinese.
It's fascinating to hear that back in the day there would be more reverence for China, because it astounds me that anti-Chinese rhetoric these days in South Korea can be part of civil discourse. Yeah. And of course, in the United Kingdom, there's anti-whatever rhetoric.
Yeah.
We've seen Brexit, but it wouldn't be considered part of civil discourse. It wouldn't be accepted, in
to say
polite
something
company.
Anti-French is sort of not nice.
Yeah, our ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss decided to say something about that. But so there are always examples that will disprove my point. But I've been surprised by how public and open anti-Chinese discourse can be in the modern age.
I've been surprised as well. Yeah, and it's unfortunate. But the Chinese have done it to themselves.
And, I guess when we talk about China, it could be Mongol China, it could be Manchu China. There's many different Chinas and lots of different rulers and times there. The president, in the last presidential debates, you talked about 사대주의, which is serving the greater power. The presidential candidates were asked to rank their preference of the neighboring countries: China, America, Japan, and North Korea.
Oh,
Can you imagine that? And you can along political lines which way they argued, because that kind of still matters to some degree today.
I didn't know those rankings. That's interesting.
Yeah, and the Conservative Party, the current president, put China very low down, and the opposite side, the Democratic Party, they put North Korea and China higher, and
America
and
lower.
Japan lower. Yeah, so those kind of, which I think what I'm trying to express in this point is sometimes when we talk about Korea and China, we do take it as a monolith, but even in Korea there would have been Lee Hang-no, and there would have been Yugil-jun, and there would have been people that wanted to, not go with the barbarians, the outside the Western ways, the Yamanin or the Yorenke. They wanted to go back to the traditional Chinese ways. There's all these different perspectives on it, isn't there? While we're still in history, one thing that I mean, you're from the United States, sir, and you will notice the questions about race and slavery, and they dominate a lot of the discourse there.
Still today, America has not gotten over slaveholding.
Right.
It's still part of the national consciousness, the national guilt,
Yes.
the national trying to ignore the guilt while other people say, no, the guilt is still there. Yeah, it's a tremendous thing.
It's part of the discourse. And my question here is about slavery, or even whether that's the right word. We looked at vassal and tributary trade for the relationship with China. Now, in books such as maybe Gregory Henderson's work from 1965, he would put statistics that the Joseon dynasty would have about 40% of the population would be slaves. So coming up to nearly half of the population would be slaves. And yet South Korea, or in modern day, there will never be much conversation about slavery of its own people. All the ills will be placed on Japan or other things. But it often got me wondering, is it's a terrible question. Is it more reprehensible to enslave another people or your own people? And I'm not sure I really want to go down. But what's your understanding, your take on slavery in Korean society up to the 1900s, because that's where it existed basically until.
The Korean attitude tends to be very gentle on themselves about slavery.
Yeah.
And that's best symbolized by the fact that Korean slavery is called nobi chedo, where everybody else's slavery is called noye chedo.
What's the difference between nobi and noye? Sorry,
I don't know.
Okay. No, I don't. No. I know both words, but yeah, I wasn't sure that.
No, I'm joking when I say I don't know, because I've looked at it a lot, and I can tell you a lot of differences between nobi chedo and noye chedo. But what I come up with that most of my Korean friends are not happy with is that I see more similarities than differences. I have a Korean sokdam that I like to use, which is taedong so-i, mostly the same and not much different. And I think the idea that Koreans have no be and Americans and everybody else has no yeah is pure ethnocentrism on the part of the Koreans, saying that their slavery is not really slavery. Well, their slavery is really slavery. And people were bought and sold. They were moved around at the owner's will. There is something to be said on the Koreans are the good guy side, and that is that slaves and commoners intermarried at a very high rate. In other words, the difference between a slave and a commoner was minimal. But a commoner had his own land, was not obliged to pay taxes or rent to his owner. The issue of slavery is further complicated by the idea that there were resident slaves and out slaves, non-resident slaves. A resident slave would be available at the beck and call of the owner to do household duties and near house farm duties, whereas non-resident slaves were the majority of slaves, and they lived in different places, and their only obligation was to pay a certain amount of rent, almost as if they were tenant farmers, paying some of the sharecropping tax. And what happened with slavery in Korea was that it died a natural death. People talk about slavery ending in 1894 with the Japanese-inspired Cabo reforms, but it was pretty well dead already. The number of slaves, I don't think Greg Henderson understood this. I don't think any of us understood it well in 1965, but a figure of 40% of the population as slaves is probably true for the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. It definitely is not true for the end of the Joseon dynasty. In fact, it might be a little conservative for the beginning. There might have been as high as 50% slaves at the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. But over time, slaves who were, living in a marginal economy, a subsistence economy, whereas the owners are living in a little bit more luxury or better off, the owners, of course, would have more children. and the slaves would have fewer children over time. And so the Yangban population is going to grow, and it did. And I think the Yangban population at the beginning of the Chosun dynasty was more like 10%, maybe as low as 5% of the true Yangban aristocrats that held power. But that group grew over time through natural birth rates. There was not a lot of social class mobility. It was minimal that a commoner could get his way into the lower reaches of the Yangban class. That just didn't happen very much. And if you look at marriage, there was no marriage between the Yangban class and the commoner class. And there's nothing that defines class better than who you marry, because you marry within your class. And if you're marrying, if you've got a household with different siblings marrying at different levels of society, that tells you that you're at those various levels of society. But today, too, the wealthy intermarry with the wealthy. And the British are famous for the peerage system. And, Meghan was not of the royal class, and that was a scandal and all of this nonsense. But in the old days, Yangban would never marry a commoner, the exception being for a secondary wife. And Martina Deuchler rightly insists that we don't call them concubines, but we call them secondary wives. That is to say, they didn't have full status that a regular wife would have. Beginning of the Chosun dynasty, they came up with some very rigid laws that you could only have one primary wife. In the Koryo dynasty, you could have more than one wife. In fact, some women had more than one husband. Polyandry was an option in the Koryo period. But the Chosun dynasty tightened the laws a lot, and one could only have one legitimate wife. In my dissertation, I talk about a guy who claimed 3 wives as all full status, and he was reprimanded by the king and criticized by the court. And he was one of the last people to claim more than one wife as full status, and it became part of the culture that you had only one real wife. Now, if real wife dies, you can have a second real wife, and if second real wife dies, you can have third real wife, but only in succession. Any doubling up of wifery was the lesser wife, the secondary wife. Now, a Yangban could have a secondary wife who was a commoner, and a secondary wife who was a slave, but only one primary wife. So the marriage relationship is interesting because among American slaves as well, you very often have the mulatto. The mulatto is the white mix of the owner, or more often the slave driver. In American slavery, a large slave plantation owner, the owner was very hands-off, and the management of the slaves was left to the foreman, the slave driver, who very often would cohabitate with the pretty young slave girl who would bear a child. And the mulatto was the liminal status. Are they slave or are they non-slave? Well, most of them were slaves, and some would try to get freedom on the basis of their father's status, like the children of Thomas Jefferson, for example. But in Korea, you also have a liminal status between, if a Yangban man has a slave concubine or even a commoner concubine, that child is now called a soja, and a soja has limitations on their status. Some soja could survive and pass off as Yangban. Some fell into commoner status, and some even fell into slave status. So the status hierarchy, the status structure of Korea was very, very complicated, and at the heart of it is the status of the slave. And by the end of the Chosun period, the idea that I wanted to get to about slavery dying a natural death is there were a number of slaves that started running off, and the slave owner would keep a record of run-off slaves. And very often a census document, a man would have 20 slaves, 10 of which had run off, but he was keeping the record of them, hoping to get them back at some point, but maybe not really hoping to get them back because, as it turns out, economically, slavery is a very poor system because you have to take care of non-productive people. You have children who you have to feed and clothe and house, and you have old folks that can't work for you, and you can't be so brutal as to send the old guy with gout in his knees so bad that he can barely walk. You can't send him out to do much work. You might have him do some work around the house, but he's not going to be very useful to you. He's not going to be producing his own food at that level, perhaps. And children don't produce their own food. And so you've got slavery is a very inefficient system when compared to wage economy.
Morality aside, in the obvious reprehensible nature of slavery that we know today, is that one of the reasons why it simply was inefficient or it didn't work? Do you get a sense of that? I don't say that flippantly, by the way, because normally what survives is that which is useful, I find.
No, I'm speaking of purely a utilitarian way, which I think is the way it was looked at. And there are very, very few. There's a little bit of writing about the morality of slaves and the morality of this hierarchical situation, but most people saw hierarchy as the way things are, and it's reinforced by the way things are. You know, there are good people that are prominent and smart and successful, and there are people that are slugs and they're not successful, and it's just obvious that, you know, there should be young men and there should be slaves. I think that the idea of all men being equal is really a radical idea that didn't occur to most Korean writers at all. So you've got these slaves that would run off to work in the factories, and the slave owner couldn't do much about it. And so slavery started to winnow down. When you look at the census documents from the 18th and 19th century, like I have, you see slavery is just falling apart all over the place. So when you get to the supposed great liberation at the hands of the Japanese, Yobaseo was almost already done already. And so this 40 or 50% slave population that Henderson would talk about had dwindled down to where I think it was 20%, maybe 30% at the highest. It may have been as low as 10%. And you see in the census documents, people who were a slave in a previous document are now they're Kim somebody. They didn't have a surname before. That's one of the hallmarks of a slave. Now they're a Kim somebody. They're a commoner. They're a E somebody. So slavery is a very complicated kind of issue.
I think I understand it even less now, but thank you for that. And
well, I think I will destroy some of the stereotypes that people have of slavery. I think one of the stereotypes of slavery is that Americans were really cruel and brutal and awful in their slaveholding practices, and that's not true either, because Koreans like to say, well, no, we were good to our slaves. They were like a member of the family. Yeah, she's working in the kitchen. She's a member of the family. But in American slavery, too, you have Mammy, who was a wet nurse, and she's nursing your children. You know, how can anything be any closer than that? And Mammy's in the kitchen when she's not wet nursing the latest child. The 8-year-old is in stealing cookies, and you get out of here. You can't have cookies till dinner time. She had authority. She wasn't just someone who could be pushed around at all costs. And the key about American slavery is it was different from Caribbean slavery. Caribbean slavery was absolutely brutal. They drove slaves until they dropped, and then they didn't mind killing them if they could buy a new one. American slavery was very different after 1801, because at that point you could not import new slaves. The only way you could get slaves was, well, there are two ways. You could smuggle them in. There was some slave smuggling that took place from the Caribbean. But the only legitimate way you could get a slave was to breed your slaves. And to breed your slaves, you're not going to be beating them and selling them off. You're going to be cultivating family units and be happy, young slaves, and breed and bring me some more slaves. So there was a certain degree to which American slavery is mischaracterized as totally brutal. Certainly after 1801, it was more humane. And then it brings you to the question of which slavery is more humane, the Korean slavery or the American slavery. Well, in the popular mind, well, the American slavery was just awful, forget it, and the Korean slavery was so nicey. I don't believe that was the case. I think that the brutality of the Korean slavery was rather brutal, and I think the brutality of the American slavery was, by case exceptions, brutal, but in the main was rather humane for the sake of raising more slaves to keep the slave population going. But you see documents showing huge variations of slaveholding from generation to generation, from year to year even. These 3-year census documents, there was one of them that I studied, and slaveholding went from 12 to 18 to 24, business is good. And they had 52 slaves one year. The next registration, they had 53 slaves. Well, they increased 1 slave. No, you read the documents, they increased 18 slaves. They got rid of 17 slaves and picked up 18 new slaves. So there's some slave trading that is going on. And that fits. It's a market issue. And if you've got a bad year, you're going to have to sell off some slaves. You know, a real bad year, you need to eat and you need to maintain your lifestyle. And the slave holding went up and down over the years. There was an active slave market in Korea that most Koreans don't like to talk about or admit.
I feel very fortunate that I live and have grown up in a world where I don't have to consider the morality of slavery, where it seems absolutely second nature, that it's not part of the economic system, the legal system. And I remember reading Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost, and that was about the Belgium slavery in the Congo, and that some of the worst slavery that you will hear of. This is slightly off point, but did you know Gregory Henderson? Because it took me so long to get his book, The Politics of the Vortex. You don't know how long I spent trying to get hold of that book.
Really? Yeah, I knew Greg. Greg, when I first went to Harvard, was a pompous old Harvard figure who spoke with a rather New England kind of English, a kind of accent, and spoke of proper things, and really kind of a pompous person when you first meet him. But after getting to know him a bit, he had a nice side to him. He was always concerned about your background and your heritage. And, oh, you're from Utah, you know. Are you one of those Mormons? You know, it was that kind of a snobby old New England style about him. But I got to know him, and he was quite a nice fellow once you get to know him. I rode in the car with him from Washington to Boston one year.
Is that a long drive? Forgive me.
It was 2 days.
That's why I asked.
A day and a half, really. But we had to stay overnight along the way. And the reason we did it was we were at an Asian Studies conference in Washington, and he was returning home to Boston, and he just aired it out among a few people at a cocktail hour, I suppose, that his ride mate had dropped out on him, and he would be driving home alone, and he didn't want to drive home alone, fearing he might fall asleep at the wheel. And I had an airplane ticket to fly to Boston, and I threw it away just to ride with this heirloom of a creature, Greg Henderson.
What was the age gap between you? It sounds like it was quite large.
He was old enough to be my father, yeah. At least a generation difference between us. And so, but I took that opportunity because I thought it would be fun to meet the guy and talk with him and ride for 2 days in a car and talk about stuff. So I got to meet him got to know him quite well. He had a sad death. he had a sad career. He got bounced from the Foreign Service for being too sympathetic to Koreans. So he took their part in anti-POC sentiment, which got him bounced out of the Foreign Service. And he didn't have a PhD. He had an MBA, and so he couldn't really get into the faculty system at Harvard. He was always adjunct and on the side. And as a result, he had money. I don't know what his money was from. One of our other colleagues at Harvard was Heinz Ketchup money, I think affiliated with what's his name, Kerry, with John Kerry. But no, I don't know what Greg's money was in, but he had money. But he didn't have a lot of money. He didn't live in a really exorbitant house. He lived in a 3-story sort of ordinary New England home. And I visited home a couple of times, and we'd host student groups there, various kinds. But he had a most unfortunate death. His 3-story house was in a wooded area, and the gutters on the house would get all full of leaves. And he was up cleaning the gutters and fell off the ladder. And it didn't kill him immediately. It was one of these things where it breaks a bunch of bones, and then it just takes you forever, and you never really recover. So I'm very sort of sympathetic to Greg. A lot of other people in my field are not, because they see him as sort of for lack of a better word, a failure, who sort of backdoor academic who really didn't make it as an academic, didn't make it as a diplomat. But he was a nice guy, and I was grateful to spend a 2-day trip in the car and get to know him.
I feel like I got to know him a little bit
through
that conversation. I do want to ask you about like other historians and figures in the Korean studies field, but before perhaps we get there, we've spoken about Confucianism, we've spoken about the history, the marriage, the slavery, the family systems, the economics. Just to perhaps put a bookend on that conversation about Confucianism, does it still exist today in 2022? Like, we're here together in Hongdae. This is probably like the vibingest place of the city, or it certainly used to be. But does Confucianism still have a hold? Does it still play a role? Do you still see it here, or is it different?
Yes, it's changing. It's being criticized more. It's being repudiated left and right. But it's being taught in the schools. And what I'm getting at is in the grade school, and I think through the junior high, maybe even high school, I'm not sure, there's a 2-hour block each day in most school situations where the students study Gungmin Yuli, national ethics. And national ethics went through a great debate, and it still does from time to time. What is the curriculum? And it started off as being just pure Confucianism. And the Christians and the Buddhists said, well, no, there's the Golden Rule and there's other things. And so they've incorporated those things in. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of be a good guy kind of stuff. But at the heart of it, it's still Hyo, honoring your parents.
Filial piety, yeah.
Chung, loyal to the state. Inue Yeji, benevolence, justice, ritual, and knowledge. Those 4 things. I say Inue Yeji in Korean, and I know it in Chinese. Run Li Yejer, it's Chinese as well. But that's still taught. And so, on the one hand, a person can pan Confucianism. On the other hand, he's practicing it. One of my examples of this is I'm talking with someone who's telling me how bad Confucianism is and doesn't fit to society today. And I say, well, okay, that's interesting talking to you today. Let's meet next week and talk some more about it. And he looks at his calendar and says, oh, I can't do it next week. I'm going to the countryside to do ceremonies next week. So it sort of cuts both ways in many different areas where it's panned and criticized, or it's lionized and protected. There's still pro-Confucianists, openly pro-Confucianists out there. But and then there are the accommodationists. One of the men that I admire most, who is a Chongson, and a holder of the Confucian tradition. When you talk with him, he has different ways of accommodating, and Confucianism is not the relationships of the people and all this stuff. You talk about Confucianism as relationships, and he talks about it being a relationship to the environment, and he sees environmentalism as respect for nature as a part of Confucianism. So there are people that are trying to save Confucianism by giving it a different wrinkle and a different color these days. So yeah, it's still around. And again, my song and dance is, hey, you don't have to be hierarchical, and you can still be Confucian. Koreans can accept Confucianism on an egalitarian footing the way they used to, the way they did for 1,000 years. I see this Confucian split as a corruption of the last 300 years. I see this hierarchical Confucianism as oppressive, male-dominated Confucianism as a corruption of Confucianism, of Korean Confucianism. The Chinese were always that way. You know, they can't clean up their Confucianism because it's always been part of a patrilineal system. But the Koreans don't have to accept the patrilineal part of it.
And then
My view.
Alongside that, I guess, comes the issues of gender. You have which has become such a hot topic of conversation these days, and many people will point to the Confucian idea of bubu yubyol, which is the difference between a man and a woman, and throughout most Confucian relationships there is that idea of byol, of differentiation. So, for example, you and I, in a Western setting, although I still respect you immensely and call you all the right names, but in a Western setting, we could exist on equal terms, man to man, person to person, individual to individual. We couldn't do that in Korea in Korean. We would be differentiated by age, by rank, by status.
By which school you went to, and what your job is, and who you're working for, and how much money you make, and what kind of car you drive. All these status markers are still very, very important in Korea. I still hold hopes that Korea, as it strives for an egalitarian society, can get away from those kinds of things. And there's hope out there. You're a British gentleman, and I'm an American gentleman, and I grew up rather poor, frankly. I have some distinguished ancestors. One of my ancestors was one of the first pioneers in Utah and was a rather noble guy. But most of my pioneers were dirt poor farmers and miners. My grandfather, my father's father, died in the flu epidemic of 1918. He died in 1919, actually, but he was a miner, a hard rock miner from Sweden. He had immigrated from Sweden. So, I have this tradition of the immigrant side of my family and the long-range, semi-aristocratic line of the American post-Mayflower people. I have one line that goes back that way. But I came from a rather poor background, and I don't know what your background is in England, but I know that some English are very proud of their tradition, their heritage, and they're very good at looking down their snout at other people. And other Brits are very good at being spunky and, putting down those that look down their snout at them. In Korea, there are things that cross-cut. One of my favorite stories, my favorite examples is when I was Fulbright director here, living in a nice house with a maid who helped take care of us, not a live-in maid, but a woman who would come in to work and clean and cook for us every day and help us with our hosting of larger groups and such. She came to me one day and said, could I have tomorrow off? And I said, oh, sure, what's up? And she said, my son is graduating from college. And this was a woman who was functionally non-literate. If someone would call when my wife or I weren't home and she would pick up the phone and she'd get a message, she couldn't write down the name of the person. She couldn't tell me who called. It was Kim something maybe, but she'd write down the number for me in a barely legible scrawl. Well, in those days, numbers were all 3-digit prefix and 4-digit numbers, 7-digit numbers. She handed me a piece of paper with 6 digits on it. And who do you call? How do you? Which numbers? Where's the missing number?
Yeah.
This woman said, "Can I have the day off tomorrow? My son's graduating from school." And well, yeah, what's he graduating in? Well, he's a doctor. He's getting his medical degree tomorrow. Boom, and I knew that she had children in school, but I didn't know that he was in medical school when I discussed, her background a little with her. Education cross-cuts a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And Koreans are very glib today at saying the new Yangban is the rich man. Well, who's the rich man? It's the well-educated man, and there are all sorts of things that cross-cut. I have a colleague, a woman who is grew up very, very poor. Her father was a non-functioning breadwinner. He did things that were irrelevant, didn't make any money, and couldn't see how he could do anything different from this stuff that he did. The poor mother raised 4 children, working in a office all the time. This woman I know grew up very, very poor. Well, she ended up going to the States and getting an MBA, and she's making money, and she's attractive and is going to marry and do quite well at some point. So there are cross-cutting things these days. And on the other hand, you've got the nouveau riche, mm-hmm. and we see how disgusting some of them are. It's in the macadamia nut KAL vice president's daughter.
The Kaptil.
Yeah. And others, I don't know what to think about the wealth in Korea today. I was driving down the road and I saw a car that I didn't recognize. Got a little closer. It was a Bentley. And you're a British fellow, and you know how expensive a Bentley is. And a Bentley is a status marker in England.
It's much more expensive in Korea, I would imagine, as well, than it would be back in the UK.
They're 3 some oak here, so $220,000.
Mm-hmm.
Which I mentioned to my friend the other day. I said that's like driving a house. That's more than a house costs. Yeah. And then they said, when did you ever see a house that sold for $225,000? So
not anymore.
Not anymore. It
no.
drives shows where my reference points are. But I've seen 2 Bentleys in Korea, and that's and look at all the BMWs and Mercedes
so
around.
Many Teslas, I see.
And
Electronic,
Teslas.
So many Teslas in the middle of Seoul, and all the car parks have the charging stations. It fascinates me just how many over here there are.
So things are changing, and I don't know who's driving the Bentleys, but I'm not sure that it's all old money. I suppose a lot of it is nouveau riche money. And where the nouveau riche
YouTubers.
Come from? What's that?
They might be YouTubers.
Yeah, and what's the nouveau riche? Well, they're educated and they're plucky and figure out how to do something. So I'm rather upbeat on Korea in that regard, because I see it as cross-cutting the old Yangban traditions. And I'm not sure that a person of a pure slave background has made it to be the president of a company, but maybe they have.
I'm not sure if they have either. I know perhaps since the 90s, the idea of the Orangejok and the Yatas, this would be the Orange tribe, and the Yata would be like, hey, get in.
Yeah.
That was the nouveau riche, and news channels would disparage these people for flaunting their wealth. But it seems to have become the thing. It must be, to meet you in downtown Seoul in 2022, with you having been here with Chonwon, no, it wasn't even Chonwon, $1 bulgogi.
Yeah.
Back in '65, you must look at this place and go, "Wow."
I shake my head, and on one hand, I think it's there's an aspect of the thing that smells of corruption and of capitalist abuse, but on the other hand, good on them. They've done a tremendous thing. On my last trip here, I haven't been here for 3 years because of the COVID.
Right.
In 2019, I met some friends, and we went out to dinner, and as we were leaving the restaurant, a sharp-looking young couple came driving up in a very fancy sports car. I'm not smart enough to differentiate a Ferrari from a Maserati. It looked Italian to me, and it looked like it was expensive. And he drove up to the restaurant, and he and his date got out of the car and walked into the restaurant. And out of nowhere appears a valet. And I don't know, but I don't think it was a restaurant valet. I think it was a tag-along valet.
Wow.
I think there were two people in a car following them in an ordinary car, two hyene. Do you know the word hyene? It's a nice word for servant or slave.
Okay.
Two hyene, people hired to take care of the Maserati when you have need to find a parking place. And I think that the people that followed them behind, the one guy got out, took the Maserati, and the two of them went off and found a place where they could park until they get the caller, bring my car back. The young couple take the car, and the other two go back home, and the Maserati goes off on its own. So I don't know if that's the case, but I had the feeling that that the valet was not with the restaurant. That the valet was tagging the people. Have you heard of that?
I haven't. I'm very familiar with the Terryundan service, which is when a person will drive your car home for you. You'll sit in the passenger seat, but you'll phone a number. If you've had a drink you can't drive, you phone a number. Rather than leaving your car and get a taxi home, someone will come. They will drive your car. You'll sit in the passenger seat. They'll drive you home, and then they'll just get the subway back or something, or they'll get picked up. And it's so cheap. It sounds like it would be this incredibly expensive service, but I don't use it often. I don't get caught out like that too much. But if it happens and I've had a drink and I've got my car, it's samanon. It's 30,000, 40,000 won.
Which is better than paying a ticket for getting zapped for it.
Yeah, I'm a good boy. I try not to drink and drive. If you do it once, it turns into a bad habit, I think.
Yeah.
So I've always kind of avoided that. But you're right, it is changing. One of the things that I've really noticed is the confidence that now it seems to give Korean people. So I might speak to, say, my sister-in-law, who wouldn't be able to name you a BTS song. But if I ask her about BTS, she'll be over the moon because they're making Korea known, recognized on the map. And a week or so ago, I was with, I see more and more people that have Korean ethnicity, but they've been raised in Sweden, they've been raised in Germany, and they've often been perhaps embarrassed about their heritage, their Koreanness, but over the last year or so, because of Hallyu, because of this success and this rise, they've found the confidence now to embrace that Koreanness. So I just want to ask you, being, you have your YouTube channel, you've been in America, you might have seen a different perspective, but what is Korean cultural success doing to the Korean psyche, doing to Korean people, both here and abroad? How is that changing things?
Yeah, I think it's mostly positive. I'm a little bit concerned about some people that overdo it, that think they're the king of the world already or something. But I think for most people, talking about the Bentley that I was just talking about.
You're still on the cars, yeah.
And I've been surprised at friends of mine that have Mercedes or BMWs and such. I've got a friend who's very happy to show off his Chevrolet. He's got a Chevrolet.
You saw my car today, didn't you?
I didn't know it's the brand. What is it?
It's a Hyundai.
Oh, of course. That's good.
Local.
Well, in Utah, I drive a Hyundai Sonata and a Kia van. Yeah. So I'm true blue. I'm loyal.
Yes.
But I've seen people. One of my friends has a Lexus. I think with the recent anti-Japanese stuff, he might have gotten rid of it. I don't know. But to see these foreign cars here, on the one hand, I'm really surprised because one of my 1965 I's says you protect your Federal Reserve, your economic reserves. You don't give your dollars out. And there was a time where you couldn't get a dollar out of Korea. It was just an incredibly difficult thing to do. But now you can buy a Volvo, you can buy a Bentley. And it occurs to me, as you ask that question, that in a sense, maybe everybody owns the Bentley because somebody owns a Bentley. We're all part of this now. And I don't own it directly, but, yeah, my people now own a Bentley, and my people drive a Mercedes, and I'm stuck with a 7-year-old Sonata, but people, we're all doing better, and so I think that's an interesting thing. I think that the BTS crowd, it's unbelievable what BTS has done, and with it is the Parasite winning the Academy Award and all of this stuff. And I'll give you a piece of data how that impacts me in America. Our university used to have struggled to hire or to teach a first-year Korean class. Our university gets all these return missionaries coming back in the third-year language class. So we had a lopsided university situation with plenty of students, but third and fourth year on. But to keep a first-year class going and a second-year class was really hard for us. And we used to have to beg the dean. You had to have 15 students to carry a class. 15, and well, we had 12. So we go to the dean. If we don't have first year, we don't have second year. You got to give us a chance. And the dean said, okay. And the next semester, we have 10. The dean says, no, you need 15. We only have 10. Oh, please let it. If we don't have first year, we don't have second year. Yep. So we get permission. We go in with 8. We only have 8. And we beg the dean to carry the class.
Did he carry it?
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah. We could. They were very generous to us to enable to keep the first, second year thing going. Now, post BTS, we have 5 and 6 sections of 101. And I was talking to one of the teachers the other day, and he said, we have a wait list. A wait list to take a Korean class? Give me a break. We would have never waitlisted anybody. We'd always put them in somewhere, because enrollments are so important. Now they're waitlisting students. We can't get you in this semester. We'll put you in next semester. Unbelievable. So that's another measure. I mean, Bentleys and Lexus are one thing, but to look at the enrollments that have burgeoned, and it's not just the enrollments, but it's not just BTS, but
right.
The movies and all of this. Squid Game. I hated Squid Game. Absolutely hated it. I hate that kind of a thing. But the way it took off was just unbelievable. I love Pachinko. Pachinko hasn't made as big a splash, but I love Pachinko.
The book or the TV?
The TV series. I was thinking of how the series saturates media more than a book does, I think. Well, Squid Game, there was no book. It was just the movie. But, it's incredible what Korea's doing. Funny anecdote for you. A group of students were in a first-year class. They were all K-pop and K-drama students. And the teacher, a 45-year-old dignified Korean gentleman, is asking them questions just to sort of get a feel for what their language is. And he asked one student, 방학 재미있었어요? Have you had a good summer vacation? And she says, 네, 너는?
To the friend. That's not very Confucian of her.
Yeah, to a very dignified.
She said, and you, but.
And you in a low form.
Yes, yeah.
Which, if people don't understand the 네, 너는, you don't say that to a 40-year-old gentleman, who's old enough to be your father if you're a freshman. But that's funny that, to show how the learning curve is not how we started out with all the formal training and all this sort of stuff. They're learning the street language and all these sorts of things that it's a marvelous thing. When I heard that this student said, 네, 너는, I thought, wow, how far have we come?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have so many students come from all over the world, especially during the summers and winter vacations, to do Korean studies. And not only are they passionate, they're knowledgeable, either about the language or about the webtoons, the beauty, the dramas. It traverses so many mediums. I think there was an idea maybe 10 years ago, just before Gangnam Style in 2012, that a lot of the promotion of Hallyu was over-egged. It wasn't quite as real. And there is still an element of where it is popular, but the passion that I see in the students today for Korean studies is incredibly interesting. And alongside that, for example, particularly at Hanyang University, where I teach contemporary Korean studies there, so many young Korean adults that have grown up as TCKs, as third culture kids. They've grown up in Guatemala, they've grown up in Thailand, they've grown up in China, and they're coming back and rediscovering and feeling a sort of pride to rediscover their Koreanness here.
And good for them, to have been in a third world country as a third world immigrant. You're the bottom of the heap. And for them to get that self-esteem to say, hey, I am somebody. Look at what I am. I drive a Bentley. Well, I don't, but my people do.
It's like when Korean people would say "우리나라" and they would say "우리 남편," our land, our husband. Now they can say "우리 Bentley."
Yeah, 우리 Bentley.
우리 Bentley 갑니다. 봐봐.
Yeah. Well, I really like how we've developed
Bentley.
that theme. I hadn't thought of that before this discussion, but I think that 우리 Bentley or 우리가 Bentley 운전합니다. I think it's a real thing.
Do you take much emphasis in how language affects culture? So while we're on this, for example, and I've had certain people agree with this idea and certain people say, no, there's nothing in that, David, which is that in a lot of Korean speech, you won't use pronouns. So for example, if you wanted to say, did you do your homework? You might say more, 숙제했습니까? 숙제했니? You just say homework did, but there's no me, you there. And if you do use pronouns, you'll sometimes use uri, our husband. I'll walk down the street and a lady will come towards me and go, oh, uri 애기 귀여워요. And they'll say, our kids are cute. And I still to say to her, they're not our children. I made these children. My offspring. But does the way, your Korean is very good, your knowledge of Hansa, the Chinese characters, is it a different mindset? Is it a different way of seeing the world like the 1965 eyes? Or is it just superficial window dressing for we're all basically the same, though?
I met a guy in my hotel the other day from New York City who is here as a design architect guy, and came to talk to him and found out he had some deep Korean roots. He's married to a Korean woman. He was here for 2 years, some years ago, and has children that are a son that's back here going to college. And I talked with him about this, and he said he thinks the hierarchy is permanently implanted because of the language, that the hierarchy of the language reaffirms, reiterates, reifies hierarchy all over the place. I have had people on my YouTube channel Koreans who are anti-hierarchy, who talk about wanting to reform the language without honorifics, without all these hierarchies in there. It'll never happen.
They changed the international age. They changed the Korean age. But on paper, at least. I think people will still say that.
I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know. This country has changed so much in so many different ways. Now, my 1965 eyes say you should marry at a fairly young age and have as many children as possible. 8 or 10 is good. Congratulations.
Football team.
But then I saw things change where, no, you only have 2. You only have 1, maybe 2. And then I went through the 90s when I saw Koreans aborting female fetuses because they could predict the gender through scientific tests. And if that little fetus was the second one and the first one's a female and that second one's also a female, out she goes. And we saw the schools, that next 6-year cycle after these selective abortions started running rampant. We saw schools in the Gyeongsang-do area, the very conservative area, with a first-year class of 24 boys and 1 girl. And, that's unsustainable. I mean, you're talking about sustainability. That's human sustainability. Well, I was really concerned because, what's Korea going to do? Drive itself into an all-male society? And what's happened is Koreans have flipped. They've said girls are better than boys.
Palpable.
Yeah, and when I get old, not my daughter-in-law that's going to be helping me out. It's going to be my own daughter who would have a little more love, affection, concern. I changed her diapers when she was 1 and 2, and she can change my diapers when I get so old I can't. I'm incontinent, and so it's been marvelous to see how Korea has accommodated. From 1965 eyes, unbelievable.
Yeah, must be.
Totally unforecastable.
Even when we were doing the ultra scans for our children, some of the nurses would still say, when they do, so they can see the child inside, it's got the father's nose. And this language was very careful because it was illegal at some point, not that long ago, to reveal the gender, the sex of the unborn child because of these.
Is it legal now?
I can't speak with any confidence. I believe it's legal now, that you have human rights to know.
Because things have changed enough that you're not going to selectively abort female fetuses anymore.
No, but I don't believe it's been that long in the grand scheme of things.
That's an interesting question. I should know that.
I should as well. But you're right to say that there was this huge focus and there was an outnumbering of boys, but now that's changed, and women are outperforming the men at school and in enrollment and in tests, and
well, I found out
living
recently
longer.
the Foreign Service incoming class the last several years has been 70% female.
I did a guest lecture at the diplomatic service. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I gave a lecture to a group of these people, and that's exactly what it looked like in that room.
Yeah, 70% women.
These smart, young Korean adults, and they're there ready to represent their country, to be a daepyo, and to be a diplomat, a representative, and that's what it looked like. While you're here, Mr. Peterson, and we talked about Gregory Henderson's book, and I want to talk about your book, your new book. But before we do that,
I'm always happy to talk about my brand new book.
I got some questions about that from other people. They said, please ask this. But in terms of other books, in terms of people want to learn about Korean history, and I just wonder whether you have any views, because, for example, there's Michael Breen's work, there's Carter Eckart's, there's Bruce Cummings, there's Gi-baek Lee, there's Om Ji-hyun. Do you have a sense, as a historian, as a Korean historian, would these people kind of get it right, or these people write well, or this is what you should be reading?
Well, I'm partial to the book you referred to as the Eckert book. Eckert was just sort of the last editor on the team who alphabetically is first. That was really Iggy Beck's book that was translated by Ed Wagner, and the original book was A New History of Korea, and it was considered too heavy because it was almost encyclopedic. That's a great book, but it's too heavy for undergraduates.
It's a big brown one. The
brown
cover I have. Yeah.
And so Eckert and Mike Robinson and Yu Young-ik joined the team with Wagner and Iggy Beck and added 20th century stuff. Iggy Beck is a Sheila guy, and his story basically ended somewhere in 1960, not much of the 20th century, really. So they added these 3 20th century, turn-of-the-century people who added a lot, and Eckert was the first one on the list, and so he gets all the credit for it. But that's a really magnificent book. I think that's really the best one that's out there. There's some other books. A friend of mine by the name of Kim Jung-gil wrote one the other day, and his is really nice. The other day it came out 3-4 years ago, and it's a nice book. He's a diplomat who was concerned that foreign people didn't understand Korea very well, and he wanted to tell his story. And he's a retired diplomat who, as soon as he retired, he wanted to write the book. And he came to BYU, and as a 66, 7-year-old man, acted like a graduate student. He burrowed himself in. I was just so impressed with him. So his book's very nice.
Any idea on the title of the Kim Jung-gil book? Or?
Korean history. I can't remember.
It's okay. Yeah.
Greenwood Press is the press that he found. And not to toot my own horn, but let me toot my own horn. I wrote a history of Korea that I think is very undergraduate, very readable, and I have a lot of anecdotal material. I put a lot of sidebars in. And as you've seen from this discussion, I'm good at sidebars. I like to give the anecdote which adds to it's the kimchi for the meal. It adds some spice to what we're talking about. And so my book was published by Facts on File, or out of New York, and I don't know if it's how available it was. I don't know how well it sold, but I'm proud of that one. I like that book.
I have that book. That I believe in your book there, you start with how old is Korea? Well, according to this perspective, it's 5,000. According to this perspective, it's 2,000 years.
Yeah.
It's 70 years. That's
good for you. That's the way I start. The question is what is history, and why do Koreans always say 5,000 when of the options of how to evaluate history, 5,000 years is probably the worst of the several options.
At least I read the start of it. I did some study. I can remember the books. Yeah. I've really enjoyed one of the books that I give my students these days is Theodore June New's book. He's based out of Yonsei. And his book is called The Korea's Divided Nation, something like that. It's 2021. It's very new, but it really resonates with young people because it tells South Korea and North Korea, but it brings it right up to the modern, and it looks at music in the 1970s. It looks like sports players. It looks at gender and transgender issues. It's the kind of book that resonates with the people today, but is still genuine history, if you see what I mean. So I found a lot of value in Theodore Junior's work. Shall we talk about your book, because
it just came out? I'm very happy about it. It came about because of my YouTube channel. The publisher of the book said, "Oh my goodness, this guy's got 140,000 subscribers. Maybe if a tenth of them buy the book, that's a lot of books." So he knows a friend of mine who's my co-author, the man who asked me a question and then I respond for 2-3 pages. Shin Chae-yong was the professor's name. Anyway, the two of them concocted the idea and presented it to me, and I was more than happy to jump on it. For one thing, it was an easy write, and therefore it's an easy read. By saying it's an easy write, it's not a footnoted textbook kind of thing. It's more of a background, popular kind of book. And the reason I did it is because of the YouTube. And the reason I did the YouTube is when I've written books before, you get a press run of 1,000 books that are maybe used in a graduate seminar, maybe not. And it doesn't have any impact on the real world. And I was particularly disappointed that my dissertation, which I published at Cornell, I saw to the translation of it into Korean. I didn't wait for, like many of my colleagues, wait for it to catch on and then translate it into Korean by someone else. I wanted to see my book into Korean early. And so I arranged for a translator, and I worked with her, and we got the book out in Korean in 97 or something. And I was waiting for my point of view to show up in the textbook. That point of view being that Confucianism is of two genres, that the oppressive late Confucianism is late, and that the earlier Confucianism is more egalitarian and is more acceptable in the modern world. So anyway, that's what I hoped would show up in the textbook. But the textbooks don't talk about that. They talk about Confucianism came in the beginning of the Joseon dynasty, had been oppressive from the beginning, and that's all wrong and not useful to Koreans today. So frustrated that people weren't aware of my work, I launched into YouTube. And I got into it through the good fortune of having a student who was a successful YouTuber. Hi Chad is the name of his channel. And Chad Tanner is his name. He's a bright guy who has a sense about these things. And he thought, well, he just stumbled into it. Everybody that does YouTube stumbles into it. And he stumbled into it and has 280,000 subscribers now. And so he helped me get started. And I monetized on my first video. And I didn't know that was a marvelous thing. I've since found out from other people that to monetize at all is marvelous, but to monetize on your first video is just unheard of.
What was the first video on?
The first video was on Korean names. Why are there so many Kims? Which boils down to one of my major topics and one of my major poke in the ribs to Koreans, and that is, you've never told me why there's so many Kims, or why there's so many Kims, E's, and Poks. And Yobaseo, you think this is a natural thing. It is not natural. No country in the world has 21% of one surname. Now, the Vietnamese do, but that's a distorted thing. That everybody had to become a Nguyen to get along with the Nguyen dynasty. But integrated, integral, genuine surnames. Korea is off the charts. Only 250 surnames total. And you compare that to Japan with 250,000 surnames. For every single surname in Korea, there are 1,000 surnames in Japan.
In Japan, it's quite fortunate to have a unique surname, I believe, isn't it? You want that different
You
one.
want that, and you can change your name if you want. In Korea, no way, Jose, can you change your name. Eunuchs who were adopted into the court kept their natal name. So these eunuch families that were organized with adopted children to provide eunuch power for the court, Mr. Kim eunuch, his father was a Mr. E eunuch, and his father was Mr. Song, and his father was Mr. Yoon, and his father was Mr. Pak, and the name changed every generation. You look at a eunuch chokbo, and it's got all three names, whereas you look at any other chokbo, and it's just got the given names because everybody's named Kim, it's everybody's named Yoon, whatever the surname is. So the name is really a special thing. Well, why are there so many Kims? Why so many E's? Why so many Poks?
Before you answer it, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. Do you know what eunuch is in Korean?
Neshi.
Neshi. Okay.
Yeah.
I had an idea.
Neshi or Hwangwan. They're two terms that are used.
It's never come up so far for me
So
to
far,
know.
you haven't run into that yet.
To know, I'll probably find a way to drop that in a sentence tomorrow.
Look at my YouTube on Neshi. It's number 5 on the popularity scale. It really did well. I met a eunuch, one of the last eunuchs of the Joseon dynasty. I met them when I was a student in 1977 or 78. Yeah, and so I have personal experience with what the eunuch tradition was like. But anyway, the key question is why are there so many Kims? And the answer is because of Korea's stable history. Korea did not have the turmoil that other countries did. When the dynasty fell, they would kill off the previous aristocracy. Korea did that with Baekje. We have 8 surnames, prominent aristocratic names from Baekje. They've been completely annihilated. They don't exist today. That's the way it should be in a normal country. Korea is very abnormal in that it's really very peaceful and very stable. I found this through a Japanese student at our school. She's a new student that came in, and I met her and said, "What's your name?" And she said, "Fujiwara." And I said, "Fujiwara? That's the aristocracy of the Heian period." And she responded in typical Asian female fashion that I had recognized her. "Oh, yeah, we used to be aristocrats." She's very humble and shy about it. And then she said a very revealing thing. She said, "There aren't many of us. They killed us all off." Which is what happens with most dynasties, not in Korea. The Kaya Kim, which is the Kimhae Kim, which is 10% of the Korean population today, Kaya was merged peacefully into Shilla. And the Kaya aristocracy intermarried with the Shilla aristocracy. And then Shilla was protected by Koguryo, which became Koryo, and the Shilla people moved into the Koryo aristocracy. And then at the fall of the Koryo period, the Lee Seung-gae, the founder of the Joseon dynasty, when he took over, people have tried to call it a revolution. There's nothing revolutionary about it at all. He just replaced the king, and the aristocracy continued on in total. So the royal names of past generations are still alive in Korea today. That's why we have 21% Kim, 15% E, 8% Pak, and the rest of the families, Che and Chung, are 5% of the population. And then it goes down to Kong and Yoon and Hong and all the rest of the more familiar names. But why are there so many Kims in Korea? Because of Korea's peaceful tradition, which flies in the face of what everybody tells you about Korea. Everybody tells you, we've had all these wars, and Japan, and the Mongols, and then they exaggerate and say everybody invaded us. Well, I'm sorry, Guatemala did not invade you. Bolivia did not invade you. You haven't been invaded by every country in the world. You've only, I argue that Korea's only had two major invasions: the Hideyoshi and the Mongols. I argue that the Manchu invasions in 1627, 1636 were minor invasions. They came in, secured the king's allegiance, and left. They wanted the king to be on their side as they move into China. They did not go through the countryside marauding and plundering and raping and such. That was the Japanese. That was the Mongols. The Manchus didn't do that.
They just got the kowtow or the allegiance, I think they made.
And the reason they invaded twice was the king went back door and tried to arrange an attack from China. And so they came back in 9 years later and said, hey, you are not being true to your allegiance. And to keep you loyal, we're going to take your 3 sons and hold them hostage. And they did. And the 3 sons were released and came home after the end of the period. The Manchus were trying to make Korea an ally. They weren't trying to destroy Korea. The Japanese were trying to destroy Korea. They wanted everything they could get out of Korea, and it was pure plunder and murder, what the Japanese did. The Mongols were famous plunderers and murderers, but they backed off in Korea, and they replaced the government in China and replaced the government elsewhere, but they recognized the Korean government. They just set up fetters on the king so he couldn't do much. He had to marry a Mongol princess and all that stuff for 88 years, but then the Mongols left. But no, this song and dance that you get from every taxi driver and everybody I've ever met in Korea about how they've been picked on and victimized, all this, is pure BS from my point of view. It was true for the 20th century. Korea was greatly victimized by the Japanese, by the United Nations, by the Americans, by the war, and all of that. But the victimization of the 20th century should not cast a light on the rest of Korean history. The rest of Korean history, with the exception of these 2 major invasions, were remarkably stable. If people want to argue this, they'll say, well, what about the Jurchens and the Khitans? And my counter-argument is they never changed the border. Those are border skirmishes that were unsuccessful. I've done a video on the 10 indicators of stable Korean history, and one of them is the Amnok-Kang border lasted for 1,000 years. You can't find a 1,000-year border anywhere else in the world.
Certainly not Europe.
Certainly not Europe. Have you seen the YouTube maps of the borders of Europe changing with every year as the wars and this and that? And, where's Germany? Where's France? It's always moving. Where's Prussia? Where's Czechoslovakia?
Can I push back on one idea respectfully? Just because of what I've heard would be, in terms of why are there so many Parks, Kims and Lees, in that with the destruction of the bureaucracy, the state during the Korean War, the end of colonization, that many people then took those names, whereas before they might not have had a name. So they were trying to give themselves aristocratic names. If you were going to take a name, if you didn't have one, you wouldn't give yourself what was formerly a slave name or a common name, but you'd give yourself a name that befitted what social status you wanted to achieve. So is that not a reason why there are so many Kim, Parks and Lees?
That's why there are augmentations of each of those names, but it doesn't indicate the origin of any of those names. You're right. Those names are all aristocratic names. You don't have slave names in Korea, not at all. But the thing you often hear with that question is the reason there's so many Kims is all these slaves became Kims. And that's not at all true, because we've got statistics not of population, but of who passed exams in the Chosun period. We don't have any good statistical population data, but we do have a list of everyone that passed the exam. And the number 2 exam passing list or name were Kims. So in other words, there have already been a lot of Kims. And number 1 was E, and E in population drops to number 2. And the reason they had more exam passers is because they were the royal family and they had more privilege and such. So they were 1 and 2 in exams, and they were 1 and 2 in population today. And number 3 was Pak in exams and in population today. And number 4 and 5 were Chue and Chung, and Yoon and Kong and Cho and the rest of them. You look at I've got a chart of this where you look at what the hierarchy was in the Chosun dynasty and look what the hierarchy is today. There's some shifts, but not major shifts.
Wow.
In other words, the slaves accrued to the owners, and you don't have a sudden surge of Kims because of all the slaves becoming Kim. Slaves took ordinary names. The greater question is what percent of the population did not have a surname and became these additions to the regular names. And my answer is somewhere around 20%. In other words, if you meet a Kim, it's probably 80%, maybe 70%, that he's a true Kim and has a genealogy that traces back to the founder of Shila or the founder of Kaya. And then you've got the fake former slaves that have attached themselves. But you hear, in this regard, you hear a strange kind of myth, which is that the slaves got some money and bought their way into a genealogy. You didn't have to buy your way into a genealogy to get a name. You just declared your name when the Japanese asked you what it was. And if you're a slave and they say, "What's your name?" and you say, Tongbuk, Eastern Drum. They called me Eastern Drum. Well, what's your surname?
That's a good name.
Well, the owner here is named Yoon. Yoon. I'm Yoon. So I think there was a lot of copying the owner, because the distribution of population as revealed in the examinations compared to the population today is remarkably the same distribution.
Do you have any, it's fascinating to look at it that way, and I love the name Dongbuk, the Eastern Drum. Do you have any insights you might not into the name La? I know a few people. I know Ambassador La Zhongyil and Na Seung-yeon, but just that
one surname. Well, let's call that one of the more less common surnames. And let's look at it this way. There's a popular saying in Korea that there were 7 Songnom names. Songnom is a crude word these days. We don't say that.
Yeah.
But that's what the document says.
How would
folklore says.
How would you translate Sangnom politely? Well, you can swear if you want.
Songnom are non-yangban, non-aristocrats, non-aristocratic people. And there were 7 non-aristocratic names. Turns out it's baloney. 2 of those names don't exist at all. It's I don't know, somebody's fantasy that these 2 names existed. Maybe in some record years ago, maybe they did. 2 of the names don't exist at all. The other 5 names are all names of people who family members have passed exams. In other words, if they are fallen Yangban and poor Yangban, at least somebody in the Yangban tradition had a position at one time in the government because they'd passed exams. These names include horse, but horse is not a bad name. It's there are a lot of people named Ma, and it includes the name Ji, which is pond. There's nothing bad about pond. There's the name P, which is leather or hide.
Okay.
And yeah, maybe that's a kind of a lower class sounding name, because in Buddhism, the leather workers, the hide workers, were lower status.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out the P family, none of them passed the civil exam, but a bunch of them passed the technical exams. In traditional Korea, you had the Munkwa, which is the highest civil service, the civilian exam, and then you have the Mukwa, the military exam. Then you have the Chapkwa. The Chapkwa are the miscellaneous or technical exams, and these were exams for doctors, lawyers, accountants, scientists, meaning geomancers and astronomers, and translators. So these are all dignified professions, but these are all considered third class below the civilian authority and the military authority. But still, these are high-class people, and the P family had exam passers in the technical area. So all of the 5 real names, all of them, had people that passed exams. So they're not lower-class people at all. Na, or la, or ra, that's this word that has so many expressions in Korean. No and ro and such is another one. But that category of name which is below the top 20 and is within the top 50 of exam passers, they have people that passed exams. There were people that passed exams. I have a genealogy of an Ong family. Have you ever met anybody named Ong?
No.
It's very obscure. They have people that passed exams. So all of the surnames.
Have you met an Ong?
What's that?
Have you met an Ong?
Yeah, I've met an Ong. And one of the other surnames that's very obscure is Bong. And our Parasite movie director was Bong.
Yeah.
And I don't know him, but when I was here as a Fulbright student, as sort of stepchildren of the American Embassy, they allowed us to swim in the American Embassy pool, which up until just a few weeks ago was a housing compound just across from the Hangul Gilbo building. Now it's been turned into a public park. They tore all the houses out. They tore the swimming pool out. The lifeguard at the pool was Bong. So, yes, I've met a Bong. And I've met an Ong. And I love to meet these obscure surnames because there's something about Koreans that they like the big names. You know, if you're a Kim or an E or a Pak, you're of a Yangban tradition. Well, that's right, but you're probably also of a slave tradition, where there aren't very many people who are named Ong or Bong who were from the slave tradition. They're very small families that have kept a hold of the tradition but never proliferated in population. Of the Shilla period, Pak, Kim, Yi, Che, and Chung all go back to the Shilla dynasty. 55% of the population go back to the Shilla dynasty. But there are also 2 famous names. The Sok was a royalty, there were kings named Sok, and Sol. And a guy named Sol Chong was the first Confucian in Korea. And he was the son of Wonhyo, whose surname was Sol. Wonhyo is the most famous Buddhist monk from the Shilla period. Sol and Sok never proliferated. There just aren't that many people. You run into a few of them.
A few Soks,
but there aren't very many of them. And it's I don't know, it's just genetics, you know. Some people have a lot of babies and some people don't. And that's just the way it is, I think. So, yeah.
In the Shilla dynasty, there was Sondok Yoang and Jindok Yoang. There was Queen Sondok, Queen Jindok. This is a really stupid question. What was their family name was not Son? Sondok
That's
Yoang.
a very interesting question because of the royalty, the first set of kings were named Pak, and the second set were named Kim, and then there was a guy named Sok that shows up, and he has a couple of generations of king. The queens that you're talking about were both Kims.
Okay.
They're part of the Kim Gyeongju Kim.
There was
lineage.
3 in total, wasn't there?
There were 3.
Songok Yoang, Jindok Yoang, and Jinsong Yoang,
Yes,
I think.
yes,
was the
very
third.
good. Yeah, and I think the queens were all of the Kim family.
Okay. When you talk about professions, we've gone a long way from your book. We'll bring it back there eventually. But when you talk about the professions and the leather workers, the P, is the Sa Nong Gong Sang, the 4 occupations, is that true? Does that apply to Korea? Does that apply to Joseon, or is that a Confucian Chinese thing?
It's a Confucian theoretical thing that doesn't really apply.
Okay.
It helps to reinforce the idea that Koreans like of hierarchy. And Sa were the aristocrats, and Nong were the peasant farmers, and Gong were the workers. Maybe they were the slaves, and so it
Sang were the merchants, I believe.
And then merchants were outcasts. Merchants in ideal Confucianism were nobodies. In reality, they wanted to go on the tribute mission to China to make some money. So the merchants are hiding under the surface all over the place. But they're under the surface in Korea, which is really interesting because merchants were an important class in China, and they were an important class in Japan. But they were an unimportant class in Korea. They were not welcomed. They were not recognized as a class. And when the merchants started to function more in the late 17th and 18th, 19th century, they were considered lower class. But it's interesting because some of the Yangban would invest in the merchants and make more money on the side.
Your idea of your book, I just want to bring it back here before we lose it. And your new book is written in Korean, by the way.
It is in Korean. I wrote a couple of chapters in Korean, but most of it I wrote in English and had it translated. I mentioned it was an easy book.
Shin Tae-yong, you said, was helping you translate or something like that. Yeah. One friend of mine, Nick Tini, whose catchphrase is "Let's go," he said he was so surprised to be able to walk into Kyobo bookstore and pick up a book in the history section, your book, and then in the first chapter have content delivered that said Korean history is stable, it's not marred by invasion, it's not this, because some historians will count every sort of pirate fleet that came off the store, and they'll count 500 invasions in a year or something. Yeah. You pointed to, and Nick Tini said that he was amazed to read this in Korean in a Korean bookstore. Kay Park, who's a young historian who I've had on the podcast before.
She did a video with me as well. I saw her on your.
Yeah, she was
bright young gal.
Very, and she wants to hear so much about your book. So in that sense, you're challenging this idea that Korean history is not sad, it's not tragic, it's not characteristic and marked by this Han. It's not something that should be, because that is a narrative that you get. And some of that does apply to the 20th century, which you've said. I also find that whether it's true or not, in some aspects, it's been very useful for the Korean people to rally around and to have this underdog status. We know in sports or in psychology that if you feel it's us against the world, it creates this very big camaraderie spirit. And perhaps part of that, I don't want to say falsification of history, but part of that historical narrative that they have suffered might have contributed to the rise, to the drive. So there's so many questions I have in there to try and unpack, but one of them might be, how have Korean people responded to you challenging this idea and looking at history the way you do? Another question might be, wrong or right aside, has the Korean version of history been beneficial to the Korean people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the idea of being the underdog and purposely downplaying their situation. This is true for the military. The military rulers of Korea like the idea of the victimization, because then you stand up and say, we'll never let it happen again. We're going to fight back and no more of this stuff for us, which, is useful propaganda for the military. And certainly, there's sort of like truth on both sides of this controversy. The way I look at it, the way the traditional Koreans have looked at it, in a sense, it's sort of the glass half empty, the glass half full. And I'm saying, hey, look at the other side of this. And I found when I started raising these heterodox ideas, that they were hammered down at first. When I'd mention just one of these ideas, people say, well, no, that's not the way we look at it. We've been invaded so many times, and don't tell us we haven't been picked on, because we've been picked on, by golly, and we're the doormat of Asia. Don't forget we're the doormat of Asia. There's a sort of defending their rights as the lower class, or the picked on class, the picked on country. But what has happened is, over the years, I keep seeing different aspects of this peaceful tradition gizmo out here. And finally, I put it all together, and when you dump it on a Korean audience as a package, it's overwhelming. When I list all these reasons, the long dynasties are not something to be embarrassed by. The Japanese said, that's why you've never got anywhere. You've got these long, useless, inept, corrupt dynasties. If you were like us, where you kill a few people and set up a new dynasty every now and again, then you've got some dynamism, but you don't have any dynamism. You're old and stodgy and corrupt. And so the Koreans have bought into this Japanese idea that it's a bad thing. I'm trying to say, no, it's a good thing to have had a long, stable dynasty. And then transition from dynasty to dynasty. I've said that it's been a very smooth transition. The Korean historiography is trying to say, each dynasty is a new revolution, because we got to get ourselves a revolution out here. If you haven't got a revolution, you haven't got anything going on. And so you've got a bunch of revolution envy out here, that we need to find our own revolution. And the revolution between each dynasty is nonsense. There was no revolution. It was the same continuity of the same ruling class. Then the idea that you've had so many invasions. Hey, no, you haven't had that many invasions. That Korea said, and Korea has never invaded another country. That's a marvelous thing, not something to be ashamed of. I had a dinner with Gukjang at the foreign ministry years ago, and I mentioned Korea's never invaded another country. Like, that's really something to be proud of. And he lowered his shoulders and bowed his head and said, yeah, we're so poor, we're so weak, we never invaded another country, which is really absurd, because they've got a marvelous thing to look at. Number 5 on my list is the border, that the Amnok-Kong is the longest held border in world history.
Can I ask a silly question about where is that? Is that up by the Yalu? Is that the one by
The Yalu,
Manchuria?
exactly, the Yalu River.
Sorry,
The Amnok-Kong. And the Tumen-Kong is 600 years old. That's almost one of the world's oldest borders. But I got that from David Kong at USC, by the way. I didn't generate this on my own. I borrowed that from him.
I was thinking of his work the whole time you're describing this, because he makes these arguments as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I like to give David credit. David's a good friend, and I thank him for pointing that out to me. Everything, one of these things that I've got on my list of 10 or 12, there's actually 13 of these things on my list now. Every one of them are reminiscent of the Korean saying, "Dungja mitte odopta." It's dark under the lamp, which is the idea is that the lamp gives light to the room, but underneath the lamp it's dark. In other words, it's been right under your nose the whole time, but you've never seen it. The idea that the Amnok-Kong has been there forever, we assume, yeah, it's been there forever. And David Kong comes along and says, hey, that's been there forever. That's significant. That's an important thing. It's like with the Kim Epoch surnames. It's been there forever, but we've never recognized it. Number 6 on my list is no robbing of the tombs. And this was an idea that came to me from an archaeologist that was on one of our trips, one of my textbook improvement trips that I was able to lead for several years, different groups. And we were standing in front of the tombs in Gyeongju, and the guy raises his hand and he said, I'm an archaeologist. When were these tombs robbed? And I said, no, the tombs haven't been robbed. He said, well, of course they've been robbed. In the Middle East, where I study, you never find a tomb that hasn't been plundered. The pyramids were robbed before the dynasty was over. Of course you rob the tombs. That's what they're for. It's like why you rob the bank. That's where the money is. You do this. And I said, no, the archaeologists have excavated 7 tombs, 1 double tomb, so 8 tombs, and they've always found the crown and the jewels and the gold. Everything's there. It hasn't been robbed. And this guy said, oh, that's amazing. That's really amazing. He says, that underscores your argument that Korea has peaceful history. And number 7 is the
Just before we go to 7, when we talk about the tombs, these are they look like grass hills. I'm doing a terrible way of describing it, but just to compare them to, or contrast them to pyramids or something like this. These are the
these huge tombs. There are 355 of them or so, and none of them have been robbed. Now, there's some smaller tombs of lesser princes and such that do get robbed, and grave robbery is a thing in Korea, but not of the big tombs.
You said there were crowns still in there?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, do we know what those crowns look like?
Oh, yeah, the Sheila crown, the beautiful crown with the jade danglies and the little circle danglies.
I can see it now, now you've described it.
Every one of these tombs has pulled out a crown.
So the question would be, why weren't they raided?
Yeah.
Was there just a really good police force? Were the people, tomb raiding wasn't a thing?
I think, yes, both those things, that there was a police force, there was enough social organization. I mean, one thing is these tombs are loaded with river boulders, which are big round rocks, and you can't burrow into them because the rocks fall down. They're not rough rocks that will hedge in each other, but you can't burrow into the thing. The only way to get into it is to take the whole top off and pull the whole thing off and get down into it. You can't burrow underneath it because they got the rocks down underneath as well. So the only way to get into it is to open it up and tear it apart from the top. Well, that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of manpower, and manpower that have to stand up against someone that would tell you not to do it, which would be the whole police force or the whole social organization. So even during the Japanese invasion in 1592, they did break into 2 Chosun tombs. The Japanese did, but they didn't get into any of the Sheila tombs. And down south is where the Japanese all were. That's where their strongholds were. They had their, the 13 fortresses around the southern horn of Korea, where the Japanese built these huge stone fortresses, and yet they didn't have enough time to go rob the tombs because there were enough Korean resistance fighters that the Japanese would always return to their fortresses at night.
Any of those stone fortresses still there?
Oh, all of them are there.
All of them are still there?
Yeah. You don't see it on the tourist brochure.
No, this is why I ask a lot of stupid questions. I hope you don't
ask
mind.
A lot of very good questions because it's obvious that nobody knows about these Japanese fortresses. In Ulsan, however, they've made one into a city park.
Okay.
And they've featured it, and they've gussied it up and such. But most of these fortresses are overgrown with trees, and they're on hillsides, so you only run into them if you're out mountain climbing. But they're all there. They're all there. And they're huge stone edifices with mazes, so you can't just walk in and assault the front gate. You've got to go into the maze to get to the front gate. And so they were impregnable things. So thus the Japanese were protected when they were here. But the Koreans kept attacking them, and they never had enough chance, the Japanese, to rob the tombs while they're at it.
You've never been in a tomb because of the rocks? Is it hard?
Well, yeah, there's one. The Flying Horse Tomb's been excavated and rebuilt. And it's got a cutaway inside the vault, so it's sort of a half tomb inside, and it's got a cutaway, so you can see the river boulders up here, and you can see how the thing is constructed. So when you go to Gyeongju, you got to go see the Flying Horse Tomb. You haven't been there?
Sometimes I forget what I've done and what I haven't done. Sometimes everything just blurs into one, and you see a picture and all you've said, I have done that, and other times, no.
The Flying Horse Tomb is magnificent. They've reconstructed it in a way so you can go inside. It's really very nicely done. Number 7 on my list is the Sun Bee rather than the samurai. We talked about that a little bit before, this cultured group. Number 8 is a centralized government, not a feudal government. And, the Japanese in the Japanese period were always goading the Chosenjin, saying, you Chosenjin, you don't even have a feudal government like we do and like Europe does. We're the advanced countries, you're the backward country. Whereas Korea abandoned feudalism in the late Sheila, early Koryo period and established a centralized state, which was much more sophisticated. The feudal states of Japan were constantly fighting with one another, and one would grow larger and gobble up the other one. It was in a state of military flux all the time. But the Korean centralized state would recruit people for service in the state through an examination, through a test. What could be more civilized than that? You know, this is the pen over the brush theory.
That's what we do today, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we give people exams and tests.
Exactly what we do today. And so the examination system of the Korea is number 8. Number 9 is slavery. The Korea has this longest held, unbroken chain of slavery in the world, which is not anything to be proud of, except that on this list of 10 things that I've got, everything else is something to be proud of. You can brag about, but you don't like to brag about having the longest unbroken chain of slavery.
No.
But the point is, because the slavery was unbroken, it's indication that the aristocracy was never broken. At the fall of a dynasty in a normal country, thinking Korea is abnormal and it's so peaceful. In a normal country, when a dynasty falls, you have chaos for a generation or two, and some tough guy who was a slave can rise up and take over. Hideyoshi was basically a slave in Japan before he took over and took over the whole government. But
similar in China, I believe, as well.
and in
Various
China,
people
Liu
rising.
Bang was a slave, they say, a lower class guy, and founder of the Han Dynasty. So the idea is that in a normal country, when a dynasty falls, there's some chaos and social change. In Korea, that never happened. It never happened. You have the same continuity of aristocrats all the way through. And then number 10 on my list is the Kim Il-pak thing. And there's evidence of all of this peaceful tradition as to why you have so many Kims, Is, and Paks.
So I need to then ask you the million-dollar question, which
Okay.
is, if the centralized state was more sophisticated, there was the peaceful transition, there was the sword rather than the pen, why did the Japanese then take over Korea?
Because they had the swords. And Korea was more sophisticated, more educated, but less military set up. And in my view, it has to do with monarchy. If you've got a good monarch, you've got a good monarchy. If you've got a bad monarch, you've got a bad monarchy. It's a reflection of the talent and the power of that individual.
Is
The
this
way
where
I-
you throw shade on Gojong? Or
Yeah, exactly. Shade on Kojong. Kojong was an idiot. He didn't know what was going on. He had no clue, and was oppressed by, manipulated by his wife, by his in-laws. It was just shameful the way Kojong handled things. And I always like to say that if we had a Sejong at that period, and Sejong, if he had heard about America, he'd want to know about it. He'd have sent an ambassador. If he'd heard about Europe, he'd want to know about it. He'd send an ambassador. If there were Catholics coming around that had science, he'd want to know who these Catholics are. He wouldn't just go out trying to kill them. And evidence that he would have gone out is that that's what he did. When he decided he was going to write the alphabet, going to create a new alphabet, he was trying to figure out what alphabets were like and what did other countries do. He sent 17 ambassadors to China to study about this and to bring back word about different alphabets. And he figured out, oh, there's a consonant and a vowel. Japanese don't have consonants and vowels. It's kakiku, keko, mame, mume. No, they don't have any consonants and vowels. Chinese don't have consonants and vowels. They have fanjie, where you cut the syllable in half. Dong is do and ong. And so that actually is ti and ong. So they had this thing of splitting the syllable, but they didn't know there was a consonant and a vowel. They knew there was a first part and a second part. So Kojong comes out with this idea of consonants and vowels, which was
Sejong, they were
amazing.
not Gojong.
Sejong,
Yeah.
yeah. Kojong, he's the... But, you know, if we'd had a Sejong, if he sent 17 embassies out to learn about an alphabet, how many embassies would he have sent out when he heard about other countries? Other countries that were doing all kinds of interesting things. Steamships, what are those? Locomotives, what's all that? And my favorite dream for making up Korean history, if I make my movie of the way Korean history should have been, Commodore Perry would have heard about this magnificent king in Korea and would have wanted to have dealt with him, and Commodore Perry would have come to Korea, not to Japan. And Korea would have become the superpower of East Asia, not Japan.
Who plays Commodore Perry in the movie?
Yeah.
You. There'll be someone. What's the response to your book? So this is now on the bookshelves in Korea. This is available. It's not. Earlier we talked about Gi-baek Lee's book and things being too dense and not really available or not very easily readable. But your book is there, and you're presenting a very different view of Korean history.
Very different, and in a very conversational, lighthearted way, so that it's 2022.
Right.
Kids these days don't want to read 20 footnotes until they get into senior year or maybe graduate school. Oh. But what they want to know now is what's the general story. And that's what I'm presenting to them. And they've got to take it on faith a little bit that it's documentable, but it's all documentable. The thing that's interesting to me is when I make this presentation on YouTube or to a live audience is what I really love to do. I love speaking to live audiences because the scales just fall from their eyes. You can just see the revelation opening up to them. And it's really interesting because I don't present to them any new facts. I present the old facts with a different perspective. And what happens is they say, oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I'd never looked at it that way before. And so people are always commenting on my YouTube channel that it's a 새로운 시선. It's a new perspective, a new way of looking at it. And so the response from the book has been like the response from the YouTube channel. It's been, wow, really, I'd never looked at it. I just got a phone call from a fellow that I know a little bit, academic who's works on the Chosun dynasty, and he said, I just got your book. And I just read the first few chapters. He said, I agree with you 100%. He said, this business about, how we're picked on and we're the doormat of Asia, that's nonsense. We've got this long tradition of peaceful, stable society. He said, I agree with you 100%. And I said, well, when you finish the book, let me know what you disagree with. Let me know where I'm wrong or off key or you can't quite accept it the way it is, and that'll be fine with me. If I find that my point of view is accepted 75%, that's a C, but that's dang good for me. I'd be very happy to see that. I wouldn't mind to see 100%.
Is it, and again, I ask this question respectfully, and I wouldn't feel right if I didn't, but there's this thing in modern times called 국뽕코인. 국뽕코인, so national myth. 국뽕 is just praising the nation too much, and the queen aspect is when if a foreigner were to make a program or a YouTube channel that promotes Korea and says all the good things about Korea, it's very easy to get popular support. It's very easy to get that support because it gives a message that Korean people want to hear or that they like hearing. Do you have any comment that your message is easily received because people want to hear it rather than that's actually what happened, or you're very confident in the scholarship and know that is the message?
I'm very confident in the scholarship, and people don't argue with the content. The thing that I'm concerned about in that regard, as far as Gukbong is concerned, is what the right wing is doing now. The internet is full of these right-wingers, these ultra-nationalists who are trying to beat a drum that Korea is the source of all good in all of East Asia. Korea invented the Chinese characters. Confucius was Korean. The Shilla land was really in China to begin with. and Paekje was in China as well. And it just, in later years, does it show up on the Korean Peninsula. That's all nonsense. And that's real gukbong.
Yeah.
That's really extremism that panders to this desire to not be picked on. It panders this desire of not being victimized by overdoing Korea's status. Another part of this, I haven't gone to war with them yet, but I anticipate that I will at some point, was the Hwandan Kogi group. Do you know about Hwandan Kogi?
No.
Kogi sounds like pulgogi. It sounds like meat.
Yes.
It's not meat. It's the old record, Kogi.
Okay.
Hwandan refers to Hwanung, the Lord of Heaven, and Tangun, the Lord of Earth. And it goes back and looks at the Tangun myth as reality. And it looks at Tangun not as a person, but as a title for king. So if you have a Tangun that lives for 1,000 years, it's a series of kings, not one man. And so it's a way of giving Tangun myth some reality in a rational sort of way. Well, everyone that's looked at Hwandan Kogi, it's a book. Anyone that's looked at Hwandan Kogi objectively says it's a forgery. It's not an old text at all. But there are a bunch of people out there that buy into that. And that's real gukbong. That's real ultranationalism. Yeah. What I'm doing is walking a pretty fine line, actually, to try to tell Koreans they should be more proud of their history. But I'm doing so without exaggeration, without rah-rah, hip-hip, let's think of ourselves as superpowers. I'm trying to say, no, just look at it, And if somebody wants to say, well, your few invasion things is a little bit overstated. There really have been more invasions. I'll welcome that debate. I dismiss the Jurchen and Khitan invasions completely, and maybe I shouldn't, because some of those were pretty bloody. But none of them changed the border. None of them moved the line. And so where's the impact of the invasion if it doesn't change anything? In other words, Korea was able to resist. And in this regard, who won the war of the Japanese invasion of 1592? Koreans talk about how they were so beaten up and so demoralized and dehumanized and degraded in every way by the Japanese. But who won the war? The Koreans won the war. The Japanese left in defeat, and Hideyoshi died, and his son couldn't reign anymore. It was an absolute disaster on the part of the Japanese side. And why? Because the Koreans prevailed.
I really respect the way you answer these questions. It's amazing, and the willingness to accept counter-arguments and where there might be room for maneuver. I think that's what...
I love the counter-argument. I'd love to be critiqued on this thing because usually I can prevail in the argument. Some people will be stubborn and say, well, no. But no, I love the counter-argument, and I'm hoping that my book will become part of a major argument in the academic world in Korea.
Me too as well. The Indian War, that conflict there, was it not China that was victorious against Japan, and this took place on Korean soil?
Oh, dear. Well, Korea could not have done it without China. There's no question about that. And Korea may not be happy to say that. But no, the Chinese played a major role in the defeat of the Japanese. But the shining light there is Yi Sun-shin. And who was the Chinese general that did anything? Who was the Chinese general that was so magnificent? The name doesn't pop up.
Mr. Ung.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But Yi Sun-shin was a marvelous person. He was such an inspiration. His saying, and I'm sure he said it. He may not have originated, but he said, if you strive to save your life, you will die. If you disregard your life, you will survive. And so, I mean, that's a soldier's saga. You know, fight as if you're going to die and you'll live. Fight as if you're going to fight as you're trying to stay alive and you'll die. Oh, just magnificent. And then he was considered a traitor because he didn't volunteer to fall into a Japanese trap. They had a spy report that the Japanese were XYZ, and he didn't go attack. But one Gyun, his lieutenant, the other general, said, no, let's attack. And he sailed into a trap and lost most of the Korean Navy. And so the king said to Yi Sun-shin, you've lost your navy. Fight on land. Fight the Japanese on land. Forget this naval business. And Yi Sun-shin said, I have 12 ships. It's just I have 12 ships. You know, if they sink all my ships, yeah, then I'll quit. But I have 12 ships. And he sailed right back into the fight again. Incredible.
It reminds me of that line from the Ukrainian President Zelensky when President Biden's offering him a lift out, and he says, Mr. President, I don't need a lift, I need a gun.
Yeah.
And he stayed and fought.
That kind of thing just stands out.
I'm teaching a lecture on mental health later this week, and sometimes when I see those the movies, the Chemin-sik movie, not the recent Yi Sun-shin one, but the Chemin-sik one, Myeongrang, and he's like, we're all going to die and it's going to be noble, and I can't help but think of the ramifications of the nobility of suicide and how that plays out in modern Korea with its statistics. I'm a little bit conscious of time, and because we're in a studio that has a time limit, not because of mine or your interest. And so there are some things that I do want to make sure that I ask you about while we're here.
I'll try not to go long-winded. We'll do some rapid fire.
No. We have time to handle these, but I just want to make sure we get them. The first one is, Mr. Peterson, what advice do you have for young scholars, young people in this world, people at university, maybe people like Kay Park that are not at university yet, but they might be studying, they might not be studying, they're trying to work out what to do. You've obviously lived a rich and warm life, and you still seem full of all the joys of intellectual conversation and humor. And what would you say to young people that might be in their late teens or early 20s? Do you have any advice to them academically or personally?
Yes. In a word, be creative. The biggest fault I see in the Korean educational system is it's still very stodgy, still very memorization-oriented, still fact-based only. Fact-based is great, but you've got to go beyond that. You've got to get the fact, and then you've got to interpret the fact and do something with the fact. My favorite example is Shijo, these great Korean poems that we're trying to get started in an international context to get the world aware of Korean Shijo. The world is aware of haiku. In America, there is not a student by the time they get through grade school that has not only studied haiku, but has written a haiku of their own. I don't know that haiku is taken off in the UK.
It's 575, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of syllables, yeah.
So
I'm not sure if they're in curriculum, but they're kind of well known.
In America, it's 3rd, 4th grade. Yeah. But in Korea, Shijo is taught as this old poetic form, and there are these old guys that did Shijo, and though I die and die again, though I die 100 deaths after my bones have turned to dust, whether my soul lives on or not, my red heart forever loyal to my king will never fade away. That was Cheongmong-ju at the start of the Chosun dynasty. They study the old famous Shijo, but nobody writes a Shijo. And think of the creativity that's lost if you only memorize a poem and don't write a poem. And so my admonition to young scholars is tap into the creativity. It's there. I mean, look at BTS, look at Squid Game, look at Parasite. That's all product of creativity that's come out of a educational system that's just based on fact. So take your fact-based and then ask yourself, what does this mean? Well, what are the ways of looking at this and interpreting this? And if I look at it this way, maybe you can look at it differently. What is that, you know? So this creative give and take, I think, is an important thing for a student to look at, not just to make sure they've got all the facts. I mean, who cares how old Yi Sun-shin was when he died? I can't tell you how old he was right now, but you know, he was in the prime of life. I can tell you, Yul Gok was 49 when he died, a fairly young man. But no, the fact doesn't matter. You've got to build on the facts. You need to know the facts. Facts are great. You know, you don't want to have all theoretical stuff. That drives me nuts. In fact, the way my brain is structured, everybody's brain is different. Everybody's structured differently. My brain is structured that I cannot do philosophy. I can't do it. It just drives me nuts. You know, who cares? I do the philosophical impact. I do look at where the Confucian society functioned. I'm interested in that. My brain can understand that. But we've all got different brains, and who can say that one's is better than the other? Einstein was considered a joker and a goofball and early on, and nobody took him seriously. But you know, you've got to do what you've got to do, and you've got to find your own creativity. And so my admonition for young students is be creative, and take the basic facts you've got, but do something interesting. Do something interesting that's never been done before.
Write a shijo.
Write
your own shijo, and writing your own shijo might be producing a webtoon or writing an essay that goes beyond the facts and finds the answers deep inside.
Or sing your shijo.
Sing your shijo, yes.
Or do something creative. Do something that's never been done. That I don't know if Korean students are taught this, and I don't know if UK students are taught this, but American students believe that they can do something that nobody else can do. Every American student thinks that they can be the best in the world at one niche, whatever it is. Are UK students taught that?
I've been in South Korea for nearly 20 years, so my knowledge is more. I spend all my time with South Korean students these days, and the impression that I would get here is that you don't stand out. It's better to, be the stable, get the stability, and if you don't try for something. And so many students in my class where they're asked to analyze, they're asked to subjectively interpret objective facts. That's part of the methodology. So many of them struggle with it because they'll just produce an objective report or a repetition of the information.
They want to know what the right answer is.
Yeah, exactly. It is changing. I will say that so many young people now are curious and intelligent. Although in your answer, shijo is a metaphor. It is a metaphor for a dance or for a song or for anything it might be.
A whole range of creative activity.
A physical formula, a biological construction. It might be anything.
Yeah.
When you asked me about a haiku, I said 575 immediately, and then you beautifully performed a shijo from the start of the Chosun dynasty about a man dying 1,000 deaths and the heart still going on. Are you able to very quickly explain the structure? Is it syllable based, or is there a pattern?
It's syllable based. It's syllable based. It's flexible syllable based. It's 3 lines with 4 segments in each line, and each of these 4 segments has 4 beats or 3 beats. And the last line has to start with 3 beats, and then it breaks the 4 into 5, 6, 7, or 8, and then returns to 3 and 4 again at the end.
So there is a pattern. It's flexible.
Absolutely.
But there is a pattern. Do you know David Fields?
No.
David P. Fields. He wrote a good book on Lee Seung-man called Foreign Friends. He's a historian. I want to say Wisconsin, but that might be wrong. I'm sorry, David. But he often writes shijos on the internet.
Oh, really?
Yes, really, he does. Yeah, that's why I wondered. I thought you might, but he often writes shijos, and he's like, "Here's my shijo for this week," and he's a member. Look him up and see what his shijos is like. But
yeah, well, thank you for the tip. When I was post graduate school, when I was dissertation writing, David McCann, my colleague, was also writing his dissertation, and he was frustrated that our advisor, Professor Wagner, is famously slow at responding. You know, he burrows in and he doesn't answer the letters, or the letters back in those days. So David figured out he'd write a shijo to Professor Wagner, who then would feel compelled to write a shijo back. And then he would answer his letter and say something back. So, again, creativity. Who'd have thought of such a thing?
I love it. And creativity as well. I don't know if you remember, but at the start of this conversation, you were using some very creative verbs. I think you were saying zombieing or samurai and things like this. So young people, please shijo your life.
Yeah.
Shijo is a verb. We have that, shijoing things. I love the creativity despite the advancing years, and that's why I love asking these questions. Perhaps
you keep talking about my advancing years. An older person, an older person doesn't think he's older.
What do they think?
They think they're younger. I think you and I are the same age, but I've just been around a little bit longer.
I can get that. I can go with that, though. I would be quite happy with that. I feel that. I feel that connection in our conversation, by the way. But I did want to ask you this question, and feel free to pass if you don't think it's appropriate. But as you age and as you get busier in your retirement, I find that a remarkable thing. There's two parts to this question. Does your perspective or understanding or how you see the world change because of age? And the second part, which is, as you get older, do you ever think about death? Does it scare you?
Yeah, it scares me. Death scares me, but I hope that when I'm ready to die, I'm ready to die. That I'm not afraid of it. My mother-in-law was a great example. When we found out she had a very severe cancer and she only had a few weeks or months to live, she said, "That's okay. I've had a good life." So eventually, when I get to that point. At this point, though, I'm still quite vital. My wife says that I'm working now more than when I was working.
I can believe that.
That once you retire, you're sort of free again, and you can do whatever you want to do. And I think that determines a lot of who you really are. If you're teaching all the time and then you retire and play golf, it says you're really a golfer, I guess. But if you've been a teacher all your life and then when you retire and you do nothing but teaching, I guess it says you're a teacher, which I'm proud of myself about. I like that. You ask if my attitudes or perspectives on the world have changed. Yes, I've become much more mellow. I'm much more mellow. After raising children and now seeing grandchildren, things that would upset me or are things I would think would need correction, I don't correct anymore. I let it go, and it's okay.
It's a bit Taoist of you.
It is. I've turned into a hippie in my old age. It's very Taoist. It's very wu-wei. And things that used to drive me or upset me don't upset me anymore. I just roll with it more.
Could you explain Wu Wei? I know it, but there might be some people that are not quite familiar with Wu
Wei.
And I think it's one of the best things ever. I sometimes say it to my students, and these might be students that look at me and go, like you just said, "David, I just don't do philosophy," and this sounds like philosophy, and they won't get it. But I love the principle of Wu Wei.
Wu Wei. Mu Wei is the Korean pronunciation. Mu Wei.
I didn't know that.
Which is do not do. Do not do. Just go with the flow. Let it run. I have. If I'm a Taoist now, I have not been, because I used to say, if you go with the flow, you're going downhill, because the flow always rolls downhill, and you want to climb the hill, not to roll downhill with the water, with the river. But maybe I'm becoming more Wu Wei as I get older, as I get more mellow. I'm definitely more mellow than I used to be. My undergraduate advisor at BYU, after I went to Harvard and came back with a PhD and started teaching at BYU, he commented about young scholars are always digging their own foxhole. they're digging their own place to fight. They're going to take their stand, and I am a great scholar, and here's what I've written, and look at my list of publications and all this stuff, and you fight for the right and all of this stuff. And there's a part of the old saying that, why is there so much fighting in academics? And the answer is because the stakes are so low. The stakes are not high. The stakes are low. And so there's a lot of fighting over, the right adjective or something. And I suppose I was digging my foxhole, or my advisor wouldn't have said that. I think he was saying that because he saw me as a firebrand young scholar digging my own foxhole. But no, I don't dig foxholes anymore, and I don't want to see anybody else in a foxhole. I want to get out and sing Silent Night. What I'm getting at is the famous incident in the World War I, where the British and the Germans were in foxholes and shooting at each other during the day, and it was Christmas Eve. You know the story?
Yeah.
And I think it was a German singer that started singing Silent Night, and the Brits all joined in, and everybody sang Silent Night, and there was a truce on the field until the commander started yelling, "Get back in your foxholes."
There was a game of football as well. Sorry, soccer. There was a game, I believe, game of football on Christmas Day.
Oh.
The Germans probably won. They beat us at the football normally, but
The Brits do well in football, though.
we do better in the wars against the Germans than we do in the football.
They can win the World Cup a few times, but we won the war.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a British kukbong song. I'm so surprised. I love the idea of Wu Wei. Just to touch on that before the foxholes, because if you want something done, don't do it. The great leader doesn't lead; they just let the other people do it. There's this idea: if you push everything left, it's going to go right. There's this pendulum swinging, and sometimes you've just got to let the waves flow and go with them. And sometimes there's this great push and desire to do something, but whether it's unintended consequences, the cunning of reason, you end up achieving the opposite of what you go out to do. And so Wu Wei sometimes says, let go of those desires and impetuses, and you'll get what you want. Or you might get something that you didn't realize you wanted.
Yeah, and you wanted it after all, once you see what it is. Indeed. I've got a good friend who has a PhD from Harvard, just a few years ahead of me, 2 years ahead of me, and started in academics, but ended up in business as a cultural analyst and advisor. And he knows Myers-Briggs, the Myers-Briggs psychological profile, and he does that sort of stuff, and he's hired by various companies to go in and fix what's wrong. And he goes in and analyzes people and says, no wonder you got a problem. You're INTJ and you're ASBY or whatever, you're different personalities. He talks about how to get along. But he's a Taoist. He uses Taoist philosophy all the time in his teaching, and it's a way of getting people to get out of their foxhole and to mellow out and work together and sing Silent Night and play soccer for a little while rather than just shooting at each other all the time.
Academia has so many foxholes. It's absolutely surprised me just how aggressive and hostile some people can be, even in our little field of Korean studies. It's sometimes even more traumatic than working in media, and I do both, but the hostility. Are you aware of how popular MBTIs are now in South Korea?
No.
They're so popular that that's all students want to talk about. I was asked by one of the universities I work at to complete an MBI test so that they could put it on the profiles. So when students sign up for classes, I refused because I didn't want to be just 4 letters.
Yeah.
We were down on the East Coast. And
they wanted you to put your MBTI on the
They wanted me
board.
to do it and submit it so that they could make a profile and say, sign up for David's classes. He's this MBTI. Because that's what appeals to students, and they want to know, this professor is extrovert, he's introvert, he's philosophical, he's this, that, and the other. We were on the East Coast on the beach, and there was a group of 6 people, a tongari or a moim. There was a group, 3 boys, 3 girls. They all had white T-shirts on. They all had their MBTIs on the T-shirts.
Posted on the T-shirt.
Posted on the T-shirts. They're now sometimes asked for or mentioned in terms of job applications and job interviews.
Really?
In Korea, when I first arrived, it was blood type. It was like, David, what blood type are you? And I would say red. They would.
That's good.
And they would look at me and go, David, I think you're a blood type B. You look like a bad boy. And but now every Korean wants to know about MBTIs. That's the really hot topic at the moment.
Really?
By the way. Do a video on that.
I'm glad to know that. I didn't know that at all. Oh, my goodness. I gave a talk at a high school on this trip a couple of weeks ago. Incheon International High School. Very first-rate school, very impressive. But the letter I got was obviously from students because of the way it was written. And they were trying to show they knew something. That's why they're asking me to come talk. Whereas, a professional would have just said, hey, are you available? We'd like you to talk on X on such a date. And so I was intrigued by it. And there was no honorarium, it turns out, but they were just the students, and the faculty backed them up. And so I went and talked to them.
Nice.
Well, they were the students, and they had a acronym. They were BBOA, and I had no idea what a BBOA was. It's their respective blood types. These 4 girls, 2 B's, an O, and an A, and that was the name of their group. So, that's part of their thing, but you're saying that if we look closely, they might be giving a MBI as well, huh?
So my point is, if you have to go to a school or a university, or while you're here, throw MBTI in a conversation, and
Wow.
It's the real big thing. I've asked a few specialists about this, like psychologists, and about the MBTI, and they've sort of said to me, yeah, not really. It's a little bit of fun because you could do a test in the morning and get result X, and you could do one in the evening and get result Y.
Yeah.
So it really sort of depends on your mood, and I'm hesitant because sometimes students will say, oh, I'm just an introvert. That's my MBTI. That's what I am. And that pigeonholes them, doesn't it? If they believe they're an introvert, say they're an introvert, that's what they'll become.
Well, my friend who does MBTI for a living has made a few $1 million at it.
I'm going to do my MBTI test now. I mean the wrong thing. He sounds like an excellent Taoist.
He is a Taoist, but he's an MBI, which doesn't sound an MBI user, which doesn't sound like the same thing.
Yeah.
But he's a smart guy. I just love to pieces. Really a great guy. Paul, my friend Paul. Hi, Paul.
I reckon that camera probably turned off about 2 hours ago. I realized I forgot to turn it on silent mode as well. So I was expecting phone calls or all sorts.
Mine beeped a second ago. I turned this one on silent, but I forgot to turn this one on silent.
I think we've probably just about covered everything. Have we missed anything just before we wrap this up?
Oh, thanks for plugging my book. It was really fun to talk about that. And thanks for allowing me to talk about my views of the world, my experience in Korea. It was really been a fun gig. Thank you.
There is no honorarium like the Incheon School, but it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it a lot. Yeah. Bye-bye.
And relax.
You don't do a on
Ukraine and so on and so on. Being more democratic and so on. Exploit us and so on and so on. Racist cliches.
American dream! I do want to ask Representative Gates. American dream!
Political correctness.
American dream!
Man, you see how woke I was? I called you out.
블레이크 전염의 가르침으로 돌아가자.
Exploit us and so on and so on. Women and so on.
바쁜데 많이 운동 혼자 사니까 바쁜데 많이 운동 혼자 사니까